The trolley problem. A trolley hurtles down the tracks. Its brakes failed, its course set. Ahead, 5 people are tied down, unable to escape. You stand by a switch, your hand hovering over the lever. If you pull it, the trolley will divert onto another track. But there, a single person lies helplessly in its path. 5 lives or 1. Action or inaction. The decision is yours, and time is running out. Sorry for interrupting, but if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is. It's amazing to see how connected we all are. This thought experiment, introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later expanded by Judith Jarvis Thomson, presents a moral dilemma that has captivated ethicists for decades. It forces us to confront the question, is it morally permissible to actively cause harm to prevent greater harm? One answer lies in utilitarianism, a theory that argues morality is determined by outcomes. Philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill would say that pulling the lever is the right choice. It saves the greatest number of lives, maximizing overall well-being. In utilitarian terms, morality is a matter of numbers. 1 death is tragic, but 5 deaths are worse. Yet not everyone accepts this reasoning. From a deontological perspective, inspired by Immanuel Kant, certain moral rules must never be broken. Among them, the principle that a person should never be used as a mere means to an end. By pulling the lever, you are actively choosing to take a life, treating that individual as a sacrifice for others. Even if 5 people are saved, the act itself may be morally impermissible. In this view, doing nothing is not the same as committing harm. The deaths of the 5 would be unfortunate, but they would not be caused by your direct action. The dilemma grows more complex when we change the scenario. Suppose the only way to stop the trolley is to push a large man off a footbridge, blocking its path. The outcome is the same, 1 life for 5, but the act feels different. Pushing a person to their death seems more personal, more disturbing, than simply pulling a lever. This distinction suggests that people perceive a moral difference between direct and indirect harm, even when the consequences remain the same. Other variations make the decision even more difficult. What if the 1 person on the track is your child or your best friend? What if the 5 are convicted criminals, while the 1 is a doctor on the verge of curing cancer? Does the moral equation change when we consider the identity and perceived worth of those involved? These questions reveal how our ethical instincts are shaped by emotion, bias, and circumstance. The trolley problem is not just an abstract puzzle. In medicine, doctors must make triage decisions, choosing which patients to save when resources are limited. In technology, engineers developing self-driving cars must program them to make life and death decisions in unavoidable accidents. The ethics of war, artificial intelligence, and even climate policy reflect the same fundamental question. Can we justify sacrificing some for the greater good? No definitive answer exists, and that is what makes the dilemma so powerful. It forces us to wrestle with the uncomfortable truth that morality is rarely simple. Whether we act or stand by, we must live with the consequences of our choices. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the trolley problem is not which decision is right, but that in life's most difficult moments, doing the right thing may never feel easy at all. The problem of evil. A child suffers from an incurable disease, enduring pain beyond comprehension. Natural disasters destroy entire communities, leaving devastation in their wake. Throughout history, acts of unimaginable cruelty have been inflicted upon the innocent. If a benevolent and all-powerful God exists, why does evil persist? Why would a being capable of preventing suffering allow it to continue. This is the problem of evil, one of the most profound challenges to the existence of an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful deity. The dilemma has troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries, forcing them to reconcile the presence of suffering with the idea of a just and merciful God. If God is all-powerful, he should be able to prevent evil. If he is all-good, he should want to prevent it. And yet, evil remains. This contradiction has led many to question whether such a God can exist at all. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus famously framed this problem. If God wishes to prevent evil but cannot, he is not omnipotent. If he can prevent it but does not, he is not benevolent. If he neither can nor wants to, then why call him God? This reasoning has fueled atheistic arguments for centuries, suggesting that the very existence of suffering disproves the notion of an all-loving deity. Yet, religious thinkers have offered various explanations in response. One of the most well-known is the free will defense. Proposed by figures such as St. Augustine, this argument suggests that evil exists because God granted humans free will. If people are to have genuine moral agency, they must have the ability to choose between good and evil. A world without the possibility of wrongdoing would be a world without true freedom, reducing humans to mere puppets. But this explanation only accounts for moral evil, the harm caused by human actions. It does not explain natural evil, such as earthquakes, diseases, or famines, which exist independently of human choice. Another perspective, known as the soul-making theodicy, comes from philosophers like John Hick. This argument posits that suffering is necessary for spiritual growth. Just as fire refines metal, hardship shapes human character, cultivating virtues such as compassion, resilience, and courage. Without struggle, there would be no opportunity for growth. But does this justify the depth of suffering in the world? Is the immense pain endured by innocent people truly necessary for moral development? The greater good argument takes a different approach, suggesting that what appears to be evil, from a limited human perspective, may ultimately serve a higher purpose. Perhaps suffering plays a role in a divine plan beyond human understanding. Just as a child cannot comprehend why a painful vaccine is necessary, we may lack the perspective to see how suffering contributes to a greater cosmic order. But this answer demands faith in the unknown, offering little comfort to those in the throes of suffering. The problem of evil remains one of the most difficult and unsettling questions in philosophy and theology. While various responses attempt to reconcile suffering with divine justice, no answer fully resolves the dilemma in a way that satisfies both reason and faith. For believers, the challenge is to maintain trust in a higher power despite the existence of suffering. For skeptics, the presence of evil is a compelling argument against an all-good, all-powerful God. In the end, the question lingers: is suffering a test of faith, a necessary condition of free will, or evidence that no benevolent deity exists at all? Perhaps the greatest struggle is not in answering the question, but in learning how to live with it. The ship of Theseus. A grand ship sets sail, its wooden planks weathered by time and the sea. As years pass, its parts begin to rot and are gradually replaced. First a few boards, then the mast, then the deck, until eventually not a single original piece remains. Yet the ship continues to sail, bearing the same name, carrying the same legacy. But is it still the same ship? This is the ship of Theseus' paradox, a thought experiment that has puzzled philosophers since the days of ancient Greece. It forces us to confront a fundamental question: what defines identity over time? If an object, or even a person, undergoes complete transformation, does it remain the same, or does it become something new? The Greek historian Plutarch first posed this dilemma, and since then, thinkers from Heraclitus to contemporary philosophers have debated its implications. One possible answer is that identity lies in continuity. Even if every plank has been replaced, as long as the ship maintains its function, structure, and purpose, it remains the same vessel. This reflects an intuitive belief in persistence, that things can change, yet still retain their essence. But what if the removed planks were collected and reassembled into a second ship, identical to the original? Now, there are two versions of Theseus's ship. Which one is the true ship? The one that maintained its journey, or the one built from the original materials? This version of the paradox challenges the idea that identity is tied to physical components, suggesting instead that it might depend on form, function, or continuity of history. The implications of this thought experiment extend beyond ships and into the nature of personal identity. The human body, much like the ship, is constantly changing. Cells die and regenerate, memories fade and evolve, personalities shift with time. Are we the same people we were as children, or have we become entirely new beings? If all our physical components are eventually replaced, what makes us us? Some philosophers argue that identity is rooted in psychological continuity, our memories, experiences, and sense of self. Others suggest that identity is an illusion, a construct we create to impose stability on an ever-changing existence. The paradox also raises questions in modern science and technology. Consider a person gradually replacing their biological parts with artificial components, first a limb, then an organ, then parts of the brain. At what point do they cease to be human? Could a fully reconstructed digital consciousness, carrying all the memories of a person, still be considered them? In an era of advancing AI, genetic modification, and mind-uploading theories, the ship of Theseus remains as relevant as ever. Ultimately, the paradox reveals the fragile nature of identity. Whether applied to objects, people, or ideas, it forces us to question whether anything truly remains the same over time, or if identity is nothing more than an illusion, a story we tell ourselves to create continuity in an ever-changing world. The paradox of free will and determinism. You make choices every day: what to eat, where to go, whom to love. It feels as though you are in control, free to decide your own path. But what if you aren't? What if every action you take, every thought you have, is the inevitable result of prior causes, dictated by the past, by biology, by forces beyond your control? If that is true, can we say that free will exists at all? This is the paradox of free will and determinism, a conflict that has troubled philosophers for centuries. On one hand, we instinctively believe that we make real choices. Free will is the foundation of moral responsibility, of law, of personal identity. But on the other hand, if the universe operates by strict physical laws, then every event, including every human action, must be determined by what came before it. If that is true, then our sense of freedom may be nothing more than an illusion. Determinism is the view that every event has a cause, and that cause was itself caused by a previous event, forming an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. If the laws of physics govern everything, then our choices are just the outcomes of neurons firing in the brain, themselves triggered by prior states of the universe. From this perspective, the future is as fixed as the past. What will happen has already been set in motion. Yet, the feeling of autonomy is deeply embedded in human experience. We deliberate, weigh options, and act according to what we believe is our own will. If determinism were true, Could we hold anyone responsible for their actions? Could we praise someone for kindness or blame them for cruelty if they had no real choice? If a criminal's actions were predetermined, is punishment justifiable? Some philosophers attempt to resolve this paradox through compatibilism, the belief that free will and determinism can coexist. Thinkers like David Hume and Daniel Dennett argue that freedom is not about being exempt from causality, but about being able to act according to one's desires, even if those desires are themselves determined. In this view, as long as you are not externally coerced, your choices are still yours, even if they were inevitable. Others reject this, insisting that true free will requires the ability to have acted otherwise. This leads to libertarian free will, the idea that some human choices are not determined by prior causes, but arise from something beyond physical laws, perhaps consciousness, randomness, or even the soul. But this raises another problem. If an action is not determined by anything, is it truly a meaningful choice or just randomness? Neuroscience complicates the debate further. Studies suggest that decisions may be made in the brain before we are even conscious of them, hinting that what we experience as choice is simply the mind catching up to what has already been decided. If science confirms that our sense of free will is an illusion, what would that mean for society, for morality, for personal identity? The paradox remains unresolved. If we are entirely determined, then freedom is an illusion. If we are truly free, we must exist outside the web of causality, something science has yet to prove. Perhaps the greatest question is not whether free will exists, but whether we can ever live as though it doesn't. Even if an unseen chain of causes binds us, we must act as if we are free, because that belief shapes everything we are. The eyes ought problem, Hume's guillotine. You see a person suffering, and you feel a deep instinct to help. You hear that lying is wrong, and you assume honesty must be a moral duty. But why? Just because something is a certain way, does that mean it ought to be? Can we derive moral rules from the way the world functions? This is the is-ought problem, famously articulated by Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century. In his work, A Treatise of Human Nature, Hume observed that many arguments about morality leap from statements about what is, facts about the world, to conclusions about what ought to be, moral imperatives. But he challenged whether such a leap was logically valid. Just because something has always been done a certain way, does that mean it is right? Just because suffering exists in nature, does that mean we must accept it as morally permissible? Hume's argument is sometimes called Hume's guillotine because it severs the connection between descriptive statements, how things are, and prescriptive statements, how things should be. A common example is social hierarchy. For much of history, societies were structured around rigid class divisions, with some born into power and others into servitude. But just because this was the way of things, did it mean it was morally justified? If we apply Hume's guillotine, we see that no ethical obligation naturally follows from a mere description of reality. The same reasoning applies to many other ethical debates. Tradition, nature, and history alone do not dictate what is morally right. This problem raises serious questions for moral philosophy. If we cannot derive morality from the natural world, then where does it come from? Some argue that moral truths exist independently, as universal principles that transcend human experience. Others claim that morality is a human construct, a system we create based on social agreements rather than objective truths. The challenge of the eyes ought problem also appears in modern discussions of science and ethics. Evolutionary biology, for example, explains how altruism and cooperation may have developed in human societies. But does the fact that these behaviors evolved mean they are inherently good? Similarly, if we find that human aggression has biological roots, does that make violence morally acceptable? Science describes reality, but it does not tell us how to value it. Philosophers continue to wrestle with the implications of Hume's insight. If moral principles cannot be drawn directly from nature or history, then every ethical claim requires justification beyond mere observation. This realization forces us to think critically about the foundations of our values. It demands that we question whether the norms we follow are truly justifiable, or if they are simply remnants of what has been, rather than what should be. Hume's guillotine remains one of the sharpest challenges in philosophy. It reminds us that the way the world is does not automatically determine how it ought to be, and in that gap lies the endless, necessary task of moral reasoning. The omnipotence paradox. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? If they can, then there is something they cannot do. Lift the rock. If they cannot, then their power is limited from the start. Either way, it seems that omnipotence leads to a contradiction. This is the omnipotence paradox, a problem that challenges the very nature of absolute power. It raises a fundamental question. Can a being be truly all-powerful, or does the very concept of unlimited power contain contradictions? If omnipotence means the ability to do anything, does that include the ability to limit itself? And if it does, is it still omnipotence? The paradox has been debated for centuries, particularly in theological and philosophical discussions about the nature of God. In medieval times, thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas sought to resolve it by redefining omnipotence. According to Aquinas, omnipotence does not mean the power to do the logically impossible. God cannot make a square circle, nor can he make 2 + 2 = 5. By this reasoning, the paradox is not a flaw in omnipotence, but a misunderstanding of what omnipotence entails. An all-powerful being, in this view, can do anything that is possible, but contradictions are not things. They are meaningless statements. Others, however, argue that true omnipotence should not be bound by logic. If an all-powerful being is limited even by reason itself, then is it truly omnipotent? Some philosophers propose that omnipotence could mean the ability to rewrite the very laws of logic, making contradictions possible. But this leads to even deeper confusion. If contradictions can exist, then nothing is certain, and the very concept of power itself loses meaning. The omnipotence paradox extends beyond theology. It raises questions about power, authority, and limitations in all aspects of life. In politics, for example, can a ruler have absolute power while also allowing democracy to exist? In artificial intelligence, could we create a machine so advanced that we could no longer control it? These real-world dilemmas echo the same fundamental problem. Does unlimited power inevitably lead to self-defeat? At its core, the omnipotence paradox forces us to consider the limits of power, whether divine, logical, or human. It suggests that absolute power may not only be impossible, but inherently self-contradictory. If even the most powerful entity imaginable must be bound by some form of limitation, then perhaps power is not defined by doing everything, but by knowing what cannot or should not be done. The Sorites paradox, heap paradox. A single grain of sand is not a heap. Adding one more grain doesn't change that, nor does adding another or another. But at some point, a heap forms. When exactly does that happen? Where is the precise line between not a heap and a heap? This is the Sorites paradox, also known as the heap paradox, a problem that exposes the vagueness of language and the difficulty of defining boundaries. It applies not just to heaps of sand, but to countless aspects of life. When does a person go from being young to old? When does a few hairs lost become baldness? At what point does a small fortune become wealth? The paradox challenges the way we categorize the world, revealing that many of the concepts we rely on lack clear, definitive borders. The problem arises from the fact that small changes, taken individually, seem insignificant. Removing a single grain from a heap does not suddenly make it not a heap, just as gaining or losing a single dollar does not make one rich or poor. But when enough small changes accumulate, the shift becomes undeniable. This presents a contradiction. If no single step makes the difference, how can any number of steps do so? Philosophers have approached the paradox in different ways. Some argue for fuzzy logic, which allows for truth to exist on a spectrum rather than in absolute categories. In this view, heap is not a rigid classification, but a gradual, shifting state. Others propose supervaluationism, which suggests that while borderline cases may be vague, clear cases still exist. There is no precise moment when baldness begins, but someone with no hair is undoubtedly bald. The implications of the Sorites paradox go beyond semantics. It applies to moral and political debates. When does a fetus become a person? When does the law become too restrictive? When does gradual climate change become a crisis? It also plays a role in personal identity. If every cell in your body is replaced over time, are you still the same person you were years ago? The paradox exposes a fundamental issue in human thought, our tendency to impose categories on a world that may not conform to rigid definitions. It reveals that many of the distinctions we take for granted are more fluid than we realize. While we may never resolve the problem completely, acknowledging the vagueness in language and thought forces us to reconsider how we understand change, identity, and the gradual nature of reality itself. The liar paradox. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then what it says must be the case. It is false. But if it is false, then it must be true. This logical loop, known as the liar paradox, is one of the simplest yet most perplexing problems in philosophy and logic. It presents a self-referential contradiction, a statement that seems to collapse under its own meaning. The paradox dates back to ancient Greece, where the philosopher Eubulides first posed it. Over centuries, mathematicians and logicians have grappled with its implications. At first glance, it may seem like a mere linguistic trick, but its consequences run deep, challenging the foundations of truth, logic, and even the nature of language itself. One way to resolve the paradox is to argue that the sentence is neither true nor false, that it exists outside the traditional binary of logic. But if that is the case, what does it mean for our understanding of truth? Classical logic is built on the principle that every statement is either true or false. Rejecting this principle would require rethinking the very structure of logical reasoning. Another approach is to suggest that self-referential statements like this are meaningless. Just as asking, "What is the color of nothing?" leads to confusion. Perhaps the paradox arises because we are trying to assign truth values to something that defies categorization. But this explanation raises another problem. If certain statements can be declared meaningless simply because they create contradictions, how do we decide which ones? The liar paradox has implications far beyond philosophy. It appears in the foundations of mathematics, particularly in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven. The paradox also plays a role in artificial intelligence and programming. How should a system respond if asked to evaluate a statement about its own falsehood? Even in everyday life, variations of the paradox emerge. When a politician says, "I always lie," Do we believe them? When someone claims, "Nothing I say is true," what do we make of their words? The liar paradox challenges our instinctive understanding of truth, revealing the fragility of the logical structures we often take for granted. In the end, the paradox remains unresolved, a reminder that language and logic are not as straightforward as they seem. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can truth be fully defined? Is logic itself incomplete? And if a single sentence can shake the foundations of reason, how much of what we think we know is truly secure? The Euthyphro dilemma. Imagine a devout believer standing before a great philosopher, seeking wisdom about the nature of morality. The philosopher asks, is something good because the gods command it? Or do the gods command it because it is good? This question, first posed by Socrates in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, lays bare a dilemma that has haunted theology and ethics for millennia. If morality is based on divine command, does that make it arbitrary? If morality exists independently of the gods, does that mean they are not the source of what is right and wrong? If goodness is determined solely by divine decree, then morality becomes arbitrary. Under this view, something is good simply because a deity commands it, meaning that if the deity had chosen differently, morality itself could be different. If a god declared that cruelty or dishonesty were good, then they would be, simply by definition. This conclusion is troubling. If morality is based on nothing more than divine preference, then it loses its intrinsic meaning. On the other hand, if the gods command something because it is already good, then morality must exist independently of divine will. This suggests that moral truths are not created by gods, but merely recognized by them, meaning that even a supreme being is subject to a moral order beyond itself. But if morality is separate from divine command, then humans should be able to determine what is right and wrong, without relying on religious doctrine at all. This undermines the idea that morality must come from a divine source, suggesting instead that ethical principles exist on their own, governed by reason, logic, or some higher metaphysical truth. Throughout history, different philosophers and religious thinkers have attempted to resolve this dilemma. Some argue that divine nature itself is goodness, meaning that God's commands are neither arbitrary nor external, but are rooted in an unchanging moral essence. Others suggest that morality emerges from human reason and social necessity, making divine authority unnecessary for moral knowledge. The Euthyphro dilemma remains a crucial challenge in the philosophy of religion. It forces us to question whether morality is ultimately a matter of divine will, objective truth, or human construction. If ethics are independent of divine command, then moral reasoning must stand on its own. If ethics are dictated by a deity, then we must accept the unsettling idea that morality is shaped by decree rather than by fundamental truths. No final answer has been universally accepted, but the dilemma continues to shape debates about faith, ethics, and the foundation of morality. In asking whether goodness comes from divine command or exists beyond it, we are ultimately asking one of the deepest questions of all. What is the true nature of right and wrong? The problem of personal identity. Who am I? You wake up one morning and look in the mirror. The face staring back at you is familiar, yet different from the one you saw years ago. Your body has changed. Your thoughts have evolved. Your memories have faded and reformed. And yet, you are still you. But what does that mean? What makes you the same person over time? This is the problem of personal identity, one of the deepest philosophical puzzles about the nature of the self. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? What if every cell in your body has been replaced? What if you lost all your memories? If your consciousness could be transferred to another body, would that still be you? These questions force us to confront the mystery of what it means to be an individual, challenging our understanding of identity, continuity, and change. One of the earliest perspectives on personal identity comes from John Locke, who argued that identity is based on psychological continuity. According to Locke, what makes you you is not your body, but your consciousness, your memories, thoughts, and experiences. If you were to wake up tomorrow in a completely different body, but retained all of your memories and personality, you would still be yourself. Conversely, if your memories were erased, even if your body remained the same, you would no longer be the same person. But this view raises troubling questions. Memory is imperfect. It fades, it changes, and sometimes it even deceives us. If identity is based on memory, then does losing memories mean losing the self? Imagine a person suffering from amnesia who remembers nothing of their past life. Are they still the same individual? If a person's personality and beliefs shift drastically over time, can we still say they are the same person they once were? Other philosophers argue that identity is rooted in the physical body rather than in consciousness. Thomas Reid, for instance, criticized Locke's theory, pointing out that identity must be something more than memory. After all, we consider infants and elderly individuals to be the same person, even though they share no common memories. Some thinkers argue that identity is tied to the continuity of the brain. No matter how much your body changes, as long as your brain remains intact, you remain yourself. This aligns with modern neuroscience, which sees consciousness as emerging from the brain's physical processes. Yet, even this view faces challenges. Consider the teleportation paradox. Suppose a machine scans your body and mind, destroys your original form, and reconstructs you atom by atom elsewhere. Would the reconstructed person still be you, or just a perfect copy? If the machine malfunctioned, and both versions of you continue to exist, which one is the real you? These thought experiments suggest that identity may not be as fixed as we assume, but something fluid, dependent on continuity rather than an unchanging core. Some perspectives take a radical approach, arguing that the self is an illusion. In Buddhist philosophy, the idea of a fixed, unchanging self is rejected entirely. Instead, personal identity is seen as a constantly shifting process, like a river that flows but is never truly the same. Modern science echoes this idea. Our bodies regenerate, our brains rewire, and our personalities adapt to new experiences. If we are always changing, can we ever claim to be a single, continuous self? The problem of personal identity extends beyond philosophy and into ethics and law. If a person commits a crime at age 20, but is radically changed by age 50, are they still the same person deserving punishment? If technology allows us to upload our minds into machines, would that digital consciousness still be us, or just a simulation? As medical advancements blur the line between human and artificial intelligence, as life-extending technologies push the boundaries of aging, our understanding of selfhood will continue to be challenged. No single answer resolves the problem of personal identity, but the question remains deeply personal. Who are we, really? Are we defined by our memories, our bodies, our consciousness, or something else entirely? In the end, perhaps identity is not a single, unbroken thread, but a story we tell ourselves, weaving together the past and present into the fragile illusion of a continuous self. The mind-body problem. You close your eyes and recall a childhood memory, the smell of your grandmother's kitchen, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the laughter echoing in the background. It all feels vivid, real. But where does this experience exist? Is it stored somewhere in the physical matter of your brain, or does it belong to something separate, something beyond the material world? The mind-body problem is one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy and science, probing the relationship between the conscious mind and the physical body. Are thoughts, emotions, and subjective experiences purely the result of chemical reactions in the brain? Or is the mind something distinct from the physical realm, something that cannot be reduced to neurons and electrical impulses? For centuries, philosophers have struggled to define the nature of consciousness. One of the earliest and most influential perspectives is dualism, famously proposed by René Descartes. According to Descartes, the mind and body are made of entirely different substances. The body is physical and follows mechanical laws, while the mind is a non-physical, thinking entity. He reasoned that while we can doubt the existence of the external world, we cannot doubt our own thoughts and experiences. This led to his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But dualism faces a serious challenge. If the mind and body are truly separate, how do they interact? How does a non-physical thought, like the decision to raise your hand, cause a physical action? Descartes suggested that the connection might occur in the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain, but this explanation has long been dismissed. The question remains unresolved. If mind and body are distinct, what bridges the gap between them? Opposing dualism, materialism, or physicalism argues that the mind is not separate from the body, but rather a product of it. According to this view, consciousness is an emergent property of the brain's complex activity. Modern neuroscience supports this idea. Brain scans show that thoughts, emotions, and even personality changes correspond directly to physical changes in the brain. When parts of the brain are damaged, aspects of consciousness, memory, decision-making, or perception can be altered or lost. This suggests that what we call the mind is nothing more than the workings of the brain itself. But this view raises its own questions. If consciousness is entirely physical, why does it feel so subjective? Why do we experience the world from a first-person perspective, rather than simply processing information like a machine? Another intriguing perspective is panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness is not exclusive to the human brain, but is instead a fundamental property of the universe, present in all things to some degree. In this view, even atoms, cells, and inanimate objects may possess a form of primitive awareness. While this idea may seem strange, some philosophers argue that it provides an alternative to the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how subjective experience arises from physical processes. The hard problem of consciousness, introduced by philosopher David Chalmers, remains one of the biggest obstacles to a purely physical explanation of the mind. Science can describe how the brain processes information, but it struggles to explain why those processes create the feeling of being alive, of experiencing the world in a deeply personal way. Could a purely physical system ever produce subjective experience? Or is there something about consciousness that cannot be explained through physical laws alone? This debate has profound implications, not just for philosophy but for technology and ethics. If consciousness is purely physical, could it be replicated in machines? Could an advanced artificial intelligence develop self-awareness? And if we ever succeed in uploading human minds to digital systems, would that still be us, or just a copy? The mind-body problem remains unsolved, but its importance cannot be overstated. It challenges us to reconsider the nature of existence itself. Are we nothing more than biological machines? Or is there something more, something beyond the physical, whether consciousness is an illusion, an emergent phenomenon, or a fundamental part of reality? The search for answers continues, shaping not just philosophy, but the future of human understanding. The ethics of lying. A friend asks for your honest opinion on their new outfit, but you can see the disappointment in their eyes before you even speak. Do you tell a small lie to spare their feelings, or do you tell the truth, knowing it may hurt them? A person fleeing persecution begs for shelter, but hiding them requires deception. Do you lie to protect them, or uphold honesty even when it puts someone at risk? Lying is often condemned as morally wrong, yet in many cases it seems necessary, even justified. This tension forms the heart of the ethics of lying, a dilemma that questions whether honesty is an absolute duty or a principle that depends on context. Are lies always wrong, or do circumstances determine their morality? One of the strongest arguments against lying comes from Immanuel Kant, who believed that moral rules should be universal and unbreakable. Kant argued that lying is always wrong because it undermines trust, which is essential for any society to function. In his view, even if a lie could save a life, it would still be immoral because truthfulness is a fundamental duty. If everyone lied when it was convenient, truth would lose all meaning and society would collapse into chaos. But this rigid stance is difficult to accept in extreme cases. Consider the famous scenario where you are hiding an innocent person from a murderer who asks if they are in your house. If you follow Kant's reasoning, you must tell the truth, even if it leads to their death. Most people instinctively reject this conclusion, arguing that in some cases, lying is not only acceptable, but morally required. This leads to a more consequentialist perspective, most commonly associated with utilitarianism. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill argue that morality should be based on the consequences of an action rather than strict rules. From this view, a lie is not inherently wrong. It depends on whether it leads to more harm or more good. If lying prevents suffering or saves lives, then it is justified. But if it causes deception, manipulation, or long-term damage, then it becomes unethical. A middle ground is found in the idea of white lies, small, harmless falsehoods meant to protect someone's feelings or well-being. Saying, "You look great," when a friend asks for your opinion on their outfit may not be entirely honest, but it may spare them unnecessary insecurity. Yet even white lies come with risks. If someone discovers they were lied to, trust can be damaged. Where do we draw the line between kindness and deception? The ethics of lying extends far beyond personal interactions. Governments, businesses, and media regularly navigate the boundaries between truth and deception. Propaganda, misinformation, and political secrecy all raise ethical concerns about when, if ever, deception is justified for the greater good. If a government lies to prevent panic, is it acting responsibly or manipulating its people? If a journalist withholds certain details to craft a more compelling story, is that deceit or necessary framing? In the digital age, misinformation spreads faster than ever, blurring the line between truth and falsehood. Social media amplifies half-truths, advertising distorts reality, and artificial intelligence generates convincing, yet false narratives. As the ability to deceive becomes more sophisticated, so too does the moral responsibility to navigate truthfulness wisely. Ultimately, the ethics of lying forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Truth and deception are not always black and white. While honesty is a virtue, there are times when deception may be the more ethical choice. But every lie carries a cost, whether immediate or long-term. The challenge lies in deciding when that cost is worth paying and whether, in the pursuit of good, we risk eroding the very trust that makes morality possible. The moral luck dilemma. Two drivers leave a party after drinking. One makes it home safely, while the other accidentally hits a pedestrian, killing them instantly. Both made the same reckless choice, yet one is treated as merely irresponsible, while the other is condemned as a criminal. Is this fair? Should moral judgment depend on luck? This is the moral luck dilemma, a philosophical problem that questions how much control we truly have over our actions and whether we should be judged based on intent or outcome. If morality is about personal responsibility, then two people who make the same decision should be judged the same. But in reality, society often punishes based on consequences, even when those consequences are beyond a person's control. Philosopher Thomas Nagel introduced the concept of moral luck, arguing that much of what we are held accountable for is determined by factors outside our control. Consider an artist whose work gains fame, not because of talent, but because they happen to be discovered at the right moment. Or a soldier who is praised as a hero, not because of superior skill, but because they happen to be in the right place at the right time. If success and failure, reward and punishment, depend so much on luck, can we truly say that people deserve their fate? The dilemma becomes even more complex when applied to moral responsibility. Circumstantial moral luck suggests that a person's morality depends on the situations they face. A person who never experiences poverty will never be tempted to steal for survival. A leader who never faces war will never have to decide whether to sacrifice lives for a greater good. Are they truly more moral or just luckier? Even our character may be shaped by luck. Constitutive moral luck suggests that our personalities, our sense of discipline, our emotional stability, our capacity for kindness, are largely determined by genetics, upbringing, and life experiences beyond our choosing. If someone is born with a short temper or raised in an environment that encourages dishonesty, can they truly be blamed for moral failings? This problem has deep implications for justice, ethics, and personal responsibility. The legal system punishes those who cause harm, even when intent is identical. An attempted murderer receives a lesser sentence than one who succeeds, even though the only difference is luck. Employers reward those who succeed in business, even though many hard-working individuals fail due to circumstances beyond their control. Is it just to judge people based on factors they never controlled? The moral luck dilemma does not offer easy answers, but it challenges us to reconsider how we assign blame and praise. If morality is partly shaped by luck, then humility and compassion become essential. Perhaps instead of assuming success and failure are entirely earned, we should acknowledge the invisible forces that shape our choices and judge others with a little less certainty and a little more understanding. The problem of infinite regress. Imagine you ask someone why the sky is blue. They explain that light scatters in the atmosphere. But why does light scatter? Because of the properties of particles in the air. But why do particles behave that way? Because of the laws of physics. But why do those laws exist? At some point, the chain of explanations must either stop or continue forever. But can we accept an infinite series of explanations, or must there be a fundamental reason behind everything? This is the problem of infinite regress, a dilemma that arises whenever we try to explain something by appealing to another cause. It challenges our understanding of knowledge, reality, and justification, forcing us to ask whether explanations must eventually reach an unquestionable foundation, or if they can extend indefinitely. The issue appears in many areas of philosophy. In epistemology, the study of knowledge, it raises the question, how do we justify our beliefs? If every belief must be justified by another belief, does this process go on forever? Or does it stop at something unquestionable? If we cannot justify our beliefs without assuming other beliefs, Is knowledge even possible? Some philosophers attempt to resolve this by arguing that there must be foundational beliefs, self-evident truths that require no further justification. But others argue that no belief can be completely immune from doubt, leaving us with an endless chain of reasoning. In metaphysics, infinite regress challenges the nature of existence itself. If every event is caused by something before it, does this chain go back infinitely, or must there be a first cause? The cosmological argument, famously proposed by Thomas Aquinas, suggests that the universe must have an ultimate cause, often identified as God, to avoid an infinite regress of explanations. But this raises another question. What caused God? If God requires no cause, why can't the universe itself be uncaused? The problem also appears in ethics. If moral principles are justified by deeper moral principles, does this chain continue forever? Or do we eventually reach a fundamental moral rule, such as suffering is bad, that needs no further justification? If so, what makes that principle self-evident? Infinite regress challenges our desire for certainty. If we reject an infinite chain of explanations, we must accept that some things simply are, without reason or cause. But if we allow infinite regress, we must accept that we may never reach ultimate answers. The question remains unresolved. Does everything need an explanation, or must we learn to live with mystery? Perhaps the search for ultimate foundations will always lead us in circles, revealing not just the limits of reason, but the vastness of the unknown. The paradox of tolerance. A society values freedom, especially the freedom to express different beliefs. But what happens when some of those beliefs call for the suppression of others? Should a tolerant society allow intolerance? If it does, intolerance may grow strong enough to destroy tolerance itself. If it does not, then is it truly tolerant at all? This is the paradox of tolerance, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, 1945. Popper argued that if a society is unlimitedly tolerant, it risks being overtaken by intolerance. Those who oppose tolerance, extremists, authoritarians, and those who incite violence, can use that very openness to spread ideas that undermine the very foundation of a free society. If tolerance allows its own destruction, should it place limits on what can be tolerated? At first, it seems contradictory. A society built on freedom should not impose restrictions on speech, thought, or belief. But history shows that extreme ideologies, when left unchecked, often erode the very freedoms that allowed them to flourish. Fascist regimes, for example, have historically risen to power by exploiting democratic freedoms, only to dismantle them once they gain control. Does this mean that some beliefs must be censored to protect freedom itself? This question is highly relevant in modern times. Social media platforms struggle with whether to allow extremist views or ban them for the sake of public safety. Democracies debate how much freedom should be given to groups that oppose democracy itself. Hate speech laws aim to curb dangerous ideologies, but critics argue that such restrictions can lead to government overreach and the suppression of dissenting opinions. How do we balance the need for free expression with the protection of a fair and just society? Popper's solution was not to suppress all intolerant ideas, but to resist those that refuse to engage in rational discourse and instead resort to violence and oppression. He suggested that a tolerant society should only be intolerant of intolerance when it threatens to destroy tolerance itself. But this raises difficult questions. Who decides which ideas cross the line? At what point does a dangerous belief become too dangerous? The paradox of tolerance forces us to confront the fragility of freedom. Tolerance is a virtue, but it is not invincible. It requires careful judgment, a willingness to defend itself, and the recognition that true openness does not mean accepting everything. If we are too tolerant, we may lose tolerance itself. If we are too restrictive, we risk becoming what we sought to prevent. The challenge remains: how do we protect an open society without compromising the very freedoms that define it? The Gettier problem in epistemology. You see a clock in a room and it reads 3 p.m. Since you have no reason to doubt it, you form the belief that it is indeed 3 p.m. And you are right, completely by coincidence. Unbeknownst to you, the clock stopped working exactly 12 hours ago. You arrived at a true belief, but was it truly knowledge? This is the Gettier problem, a challenge to one of the most widely accepted definitions of knowledge. For centuries, philosophers followed the view that knowledge consists of 3 components: justified, true belief, JTB. According to this model, to know something, 3 conditions must be met. You must believe it. It must be true. You must have justification, good reasons or evidence for believing it. But in 1963, philosopher Edmund Gettier published a short paper that shook the foundations of epistemology. He presented cases, like the broken clock example, where a person has a belief that is both true and justified, but only by accident. Gettier's insight was that one can meet all 3 conditions of the traditional definition of knowledge while still lacking real knowledge. If someone believes something for the wrong reasons, and it just happens to be true, can it still count as knowledge? Gettier's problem exposes a gap in our understanding of what it means to know something. If justified true belief is not enough, what more is required? Some philosophers argue that knowledge must include a reliable method, meaning the way we arrive at the truth must not be based on luck or false premises. Others suggest that knowledge must be indefeasible, meaning that if new evidence were introduced, the justification would still hold up. But each attempt to refine the definition has led to further complications. Beyond philosophy, the Gettier problem has implications for how we evaluate truth in everyday life. If a news report happens to be correct, but was based on misinformation, can we say we knew the facts? If an AI model predicts an event correctly, but for the wrong reasons, does it possess knowledge or just statistical luck? In science, where discoveries sometimes emerge from flawed experiments, does true knowledge require perfect reasoning? The Gettier problem reminds us that certainty is more elusive than it seems. It challenges the way we define knowledge, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that much of what we think we know may be based on coincidence rather than certainty. If knowledge is more than just justified true belief, then the search for a clear definition continues, one that captures not just truth, but the depth of understanding behind it. The problem of suffering in a just world. A child is born into extreme poverty, struggling for food and shelter. A natural disaster wipes out an entire village, leaving devastation in its wake. A kind and honest person is diagnosed with a terminal illness, while corrupt individuals live long, prosperous lives. If the world is just, why does suffering seem so randomly distributed? Why do bad things happen to good people? This is the problem of suffering in a just world, a question that has troubled philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people for centuries. Many believe in the idea of justice, that goodness is rewarded and wrongdoing is punished. Yet, reality often contradicts this belief. Suffering seems to strike without reason, and the world appears indifferent to human morality. Does this mean the universe is unjust, or is there something deeper at play? One way to approach this problem is through religious and spiritual perspectives. Many faith traditions offer explanations for suffering, suggesting that pain has a higher purpose. In Christianity, suffering is often seen as a test of faith or a means of spiritual growth. The story of Job in the Bible, for example, tells of a righteous man who endures immense suffering despite his virtue. The lesson is that divine justice may not be immediately visible, but exists beyond human understanding. Similarly, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the concept of karma suggests that suffering is the result of past actions, whether in this life or previous ones. According to this view, the universe is ultimately just, but its justice operates on a scale beyond what we can perceive. However, such explanations do not satisfy everyone. The philosopher David Hume famously argued that the existence of suffering is incompatible with the idea of a benevolent and all-powerful God. If God is willing to stop suffering, but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can stop suffering, but chooses not to, then he is not all good. This reasoning, known as the problem of evil, leads many to question whether a just cosmic order truly exists. Others attempt to reconcile suffering with justice by proposing that the world is not inherently just, but that human society creates justice. The idea of moral progress, supported by thinkers like John Rawls, suggests that while suffering may exist naturally, it is our responsibility to build systems that minimize it. Social justice movements, ethical laws, and humanitarian efforts are all attempts to impose fairness onto an otherwise indifferent world. But if justice must be actively constructed by human effort, does that mean the universe itself is fundamentally unjust? Another perspective argues that suffering is a result of randomness and chaos, rather than any moral framework. In a purely scientific view of the universe, events occur based on natural laws and probability, not moral order. From this standpoint, there is no reason for suffering. It is simply a consequence of an indifferent reality. Diseases emerge due to biological processes. Natural disasters occur because of shifting tectonic plates, and human suffering arises from chance circumstances. If justice exists, it is not woven into the fabric of the universe, but rather something humans create to give meaning to a world that lacks inherent fairness. The just world hypothesis, a psychological phenomenon, suggests that people instinctively want to believe the world is fair, leading them to justify suffering by assuming victims somehow deserve their fate. This mindset can be seen in victim-blaming attitudes, where people rationalize misfortune by assuming wrongdoing must have occurred. But does insisting on a fair world blind us to the reality of suffering? The problem of suffering in a just world remains unresolved, reflecting the tension between hope and reality. If suffering serves a purpose, why does it seem so arbitrary? If justice exists, why does it appear so unevenly distributed? Whether one finds answers in faith, philosophy, or social responsibility, the question lingers, perhaps not to be solved, but to remind us that our moral duty is not just to understand suffering, but to lessen it where we can. The simulation hypothesis and reality. What if everything you see, feel, and experience isn't real? What if your entire life, your memories, your emotions, even your sense of self, is just part of an advanced simulation? Could it be possible that reality itself is nothing more than an illusion, carefully programmed by an unseen force? The simulation hypothesis suggests that what we perceive as reality might actually be a highly sophisticated virtual world, much like a computer simulation. This idea, while it may sound like science fiction, has been taken seriously by philosophers, scientists, and even technologists like Elon Musk, who famously claimed that there is a high probability we are living in a simulation. If true, this would mean that everything we consider real is merely artificial, a creation of an advanced intelligence, either human or otherwise. The argument for the simulation hypothesis was most famously developed by philosopher Nick Bostrom. He proposed that if civilizations eventually developed the ability to run highly advanced simulations of conscious beings, then it is likely that countless simulated realities would exist. If that is the case, and if simulated beings are unaware they are inside a simulation, then statistically, it is more probable that we are in one of those simulations rather than the one true reality. The idea echoes older philosophical questions about the nature of existence. René Descartes once asked how we could be sure that our senses weren't deceiving us, whether an evil demon could be manipulating our perceptions. In modern terms, this could be reinterpreted as a simulation controlling our experience. Likewise, Plato's allegory of the cave describes prisoners who believe shadows on a wall are the entirety of reality, unaware of the larger world outside their limited perception. If we are inside a simulation, are we like those prisoners, mistaking an artificial world for the real one? One major challenge to the hypothesis is that it is unfalsifiable. There is no clear way to prove or disprove it. If we were inside a simulation, would we even have the tools to detect it? Some scientists speculate that if reality were simulated, we might find signs of computational limits, like pixelation, in the fundamental structure of the universe, or errors in physical laws that resemble glitches. Others argue that even if we found such evidence, it could simply be an unexplained feature of reality, rather than proof of a simulation. Even if we were in a simulation, what would that mean for us? Would it change how we live our lives, or would we continue as if nothing had changed? Some argue that it makes no practical difference. Whether real or simulated, our experiences still feel meaningful. Others suggest that if we knew we were in a simulation, it might change our perception of morality, free will, and existence itself. The simulation hypothesis remains an open question, one that forces us to confront the possibility that reality is not what it seems. Whether or not we live in a simulation, the mere fact that it is a serious possibility challenges our deepest assumptions about existence. If we ever find an answer, it could redefine what it means to be real. Until then, we continue to live as if reality is exactly what we believe it to be, whether or not it truly is. The dilemma of responsibility versus causality. A man loses control of his car and crashes into a pedestrian, causing serious injury. He was not drunk nor reckless. His brakes unexpectedly failed. Is he responsible for the harm he caused? A scientist develops artificial intelligence that is later used for mass surveillance and oppression. She did not intend for it to be used this way, but without her invention, it would not have been possible. Is she to blame? This is the dilemma of responsibility versus causality, a problem that questions whether responsibility lies in the intentions behind an action or in its consequences. In daily life, we tend to hold people accountable for their choices. But what happens when someone's actions set off a chain of events they could not fully predict or control? Should they still be held responsible, even if they did not intend the outcome? One way to resolve this dilemma is by focusing on intentionality. Many ethical theories, particularly deontological ethics, argue that morality depends on intent rather than outcome. If someone acts in good faith and follows ethical principles, they should not be blamed for unintended harm. Under this view, the man with the failed brakes is not responsible because he did not deliberately cause the accident. The scientist is not guilty because she did not intend for her invention to be misused. However, this does not fully satisfy our sense of justice. If someone's actions lead to harm, regardless of their intent, shouldn't they bear some responsibility? Utilitarianism, which judges actions based on their consequences, suggests that harm is harm, no matter the intention behind it. From this perspective, Those who contribute to harmful outcomes, even indirectly, must take responsibility for their role in the chain of events. The driver, while not malicious, still caused injury and should be held accountable in some way. The scientist, even if unaware of how her work would be used, played a role in the damage that followed. This dilemma becomes even more complicated when we consider historical responsibility. Are modern generations responsible for injustices committed by their ancestors? Should a company be held accountable for environmental destruction caused decades ago by previous executives? If harm is a result of collective actions over time, is responsibility shared across individuals, or does it dissolve into history? In law, this debate appears in liability cases. Should someone be punished for causing harm if they had no way of foreseeing it? In business and politics, it influences discussions on corporate responsibility and unintended consequences of policies. In technology, it raises ethical questions about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and automation. If we create something with good intentions, but it later causes harm, can we say we bear no responsibility? The tension between causality and responsibility reveals the complexity of moral judgment. If we hold only intentional harm accountable, we risk ignoring real damage done. But if we hold people responsible for every consequence of their actions, no matter how unforeseeable, we may create an unjust system of blame. The dilemma forces us to confront a difficult question. Where does responsibility truly begin, and where does it end? Perhaps morality is not just about what we intend, nor simply about what happens, but about recognizing our role in the vast web of causes and effects that shape the world around us. The intrinsic versus instrumental value dilemma. A beautiful sunset spreads across the sky, casting golden light over the ocean. You stand there, captivated by its colors. But why does this moment feel meaningful? Is the sunset valuable in itself, or does its value come from the way it affects you? This is the intrinsic versus instrumental value dilemma, a fundamental question in ethics and philosophy. Some things seem valuable simply for what they are: happiness, love, beauty, knowledge. Others are valuable because they help us achieve something else: money, tools, power. But where do we draw the line? And can anything truly be valuable on its own? Intrinsic value is the idea that something is valuable in itself, regardless of what it leads to. Many philosophers, including Aristotle, argued that happiness is the ultimate intrinsic good. We do not seek happiness for the sake of something else. It is desirable on its own. Similarly, truth and beauty are often considered intrinsically valuable. Even if no one benefited from them, their existence might still be meaningful. On the other hand, instrumental value comes from usefulness. Money has no value by itself. It is only valuable because it allows us to buy things. Education is valuable because it helps us gain knowledge and improve our lives. Governments, laws, and technology all derive their value from what they enable us to do, not from their mere existence. The dilemma arises when we try to determine whether anything has purely intrinsic value. Consider human life. Is it valuable simply because it exists, or because of the experiences, relationships, and achievements it allows? What about nature? Do forests, rivers, and animals have value apart from their usefulness to humans, or only because they provide resources and beauty? If something has value only because of how it benefits us, does that make it replaceable? This debate has real-world implications. Environmental ethics hinges on whether nature should be preserved for its own sake, or merely because humans need it. Debates about artificial intelligence question whether machines could ever have intrinsic worth, or if their value is purely functional. Even discussions on human rights rely on whether dignity is something inherent or granted by society. If intrinsic value exists, then some things must be preserved, respected, or pursued regardless of their consequences. If all value is instrumental, then everything depends on context. What is valuable today may be useless tomorrow. The question remains, is there anything in existence that holds value beyond its utility, or is everything we cherish ultimately just a means to an end? The answer shapes how we define meaning, purpose, and what truly matters in life. The philosophy of time, A versus B theory. Time rules every aspect of our lives. We wake up, grow older, and watch history unfold in a seemingly linear progression. But what if time is not as straightforward as it seems? Does the past still exist, or has it vanished forever? Is the future already determined, or is it open and undefined? Philosophers have debated these questions for centuries, leading to two competing views of time: A theory and B theory. A theory, also known as the tensed theory of time, suggests that time is dynamic and flows from the past to the present and into the future. According to this view, the present is the only moment that truly exists. The past is gone, and the future has yet to be determined. This perspective aligns with our everyday experience. We feel that time moves forward, that we remember the past but not the future, and that change is real. From this viewpoint, time is not just another dimension like space, but something unique, marked by an ever-moving present. This theory supports presentism, the idea that only the present exists. If the past no longer exists and the future has not yet happened, then reality is constantly being created and destroyed in each passing moment. This raises deep philosophical and even emotional questions. If the past is truly gone, does that mean everything we've experienced, every joy, every sorrow, no longer exists? Does death mean complete annihilation if even the past ceases to be? On the other side of the debate is B theory, or the tenseless theory of time, which argues that all moments in time, past, present, and future, exist equally. According to this view, time does not flow as we experience it. Instead, it is more like a four-dimensional block in which every moment is fixed in place. This idea is sometimes called the block universe theory. From this perspective, what we call the present is just a subjective experience, similar to standing at a certain point on a map. Just because you are at one location doesn't mean other locations don't exist. This theory aligns with eternalism, which suggests that past, present, and future are equally real. If true, it would mean that historical events, Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the construction of the Great Wall of China, still exist in some sense, just not from our current point in time. Likewise, the future already exists, but we simply haven't experienced it yet. This view raises unsettling implications. If the future is already there, does that mean free will is an illusion? If all events are fixed in a timeless structure, are we simply moving along a predetermined path? The debate between A theory and B theory extends beyond philosophy into physics. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity suggests that time is relative and linked to space, reinforcing the idea that all points in time exist equally. Some physicists argue that the block universe model best fits our current understanding of space-time. However, many philosophers still defend the intuitive idea that time genuinely flows and that the present moment has a unique status. The nature of time remains one of the greatest mysteries of human thought. Is reality a constantly shifting present, where the past fades away and the future remains unwritten? Or is time a vast, unchanging structure in which every event, past, present, and future, exists eternally. The answer may forever shape how we understand ourselves, our choices, and our place in the universe. The paradox of the ravens. Hempel's paradox. Imagine a scientist trying to confirm the statement, "All ravens are black." To test this, she observes ravens, noting that every single one she finds is indeed black. This seems to strengthen the claim. But now consider a strange twist. According to logic, observing a non-black, non-raven, such as a red apple, also provides evidence for the statement. How could looking at an apple tell us anything about ravens? This strange conclusion is known as Hempel's paradox, or the paradox of the ravens, first introduced by philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s. It exposes a deep problem in the way we think about evidence, confirmation, and how we justify knowledge. If the statement, "all ravens are black," is logically equivalent to "everything that is not black is not a raven," then any observation of a non-black, non-raven, a blue car, a white shoe, a yellow banana, should count as supporting evidence. But this seems absurd. Surely looking at a shoe doesn't tell us anything about the color of ravens. At the heart of the paradox is a fundamental principle of logic called the equivalence condition. If two statements are logically identical, then any evidence supporting one should support the other. The problem is that, in everyday reasoning, we do not treat them the same way. We naturally expect confirmation to come from directly observing ravens, not from examining things unrelated to them. One way to approach the paradox is to rethink how evidence works. Some argue that while non-black, non-raven objects technically count as confirmation, their impact is so small that they are practically irrelevant. After all, seeing one red apple provides some confirmation, but not nearly as much as seeing 1,000 black ravens. This idea, known as the Bayesian response, suggests that the strength of evidence depends on how much it actually changes our expectations. Another perspective is to challenge the idea that logical equivalence always applies in cases of empirical observation. Just because two statements are logically identical does not mean we should treat their confirmation in the same way. We intuitively treat universal claims, like "all ravens are black," differently from negative claims. Everything not black is not a raven, even if they are technically the same. The paradox raises broader questions about the nature of science. When we test hypotheses, are we truly confirming them, or are we just failing to disprove them? Science often relies on inductive reasoning, generalizing from specific observations, but Hempel's paradox exposes the limits of this method. No matter how many black ravens we observe, we can never be certain that there are no non-black ravens somewhere in the universe. This highlights the problem of inductive skepticism. No amount of evidence can prove a universal claim with absolute certainty. Hempel's paradox challenges our assumptions about logic, evidence, and how we justify beliefs. It forces us to consider whether knowledge is truly built on observation, or whether our understanding of confirmation itself is flawed. The next time you see a red apple, ask yourself, does it really teach you something about ravens? Logic says yes, but your instincts may say otherwise. The lottery paradox in belief. Imagine a lottery with 1,000,000 tickets. You know that only one ticket will win. You look at a random ticket and think, this ticket won't win. Since the odds are overwhelmingly against any single ticket, this seems like a reasonable belief. You repeat this thought for every ticket. This one won't win. This one won't win. Until you have concluded that none of the tickets will win. But this is a contradiction, because you also know that one of them must win. How can you rationally believe that each individual ticket will lose, while also knowing that one must win? This is the lottery paradox, first introduced by philosopher Henry Kaiberg in 1961. It challenges our understanding of rational belief and probability, highlighting a fundamental problem in how we justify what we accept as true. If it is rational to believe each ticket will lose, then we must also accept that we hold an irrational overall belief that no ticket will win. But if we reject this belief, then we seem to be ignoring basic probability. At the heart of the paradox is a conflict between probabilistic reasoning and logical consistency. We naturally treat high probability events as almost certain, yet probability does not equal certainty. Each individual ticket has an extremely low chance of winning, making it reasonable to believe it will lose. However, when applied to the entire set, this reasoning fails because one ticket must win. This contradiction exposes a flaw in how we handle uncertainty in rational belief. One proposed solution is to introduce degrees of belief rather than strict binary beliefs. Instead of saying, "This ticket will lose," we could say, "This ticket is almost certainly a loser," allowing for small probabilities of error. This approach, called Bayesian epistemology, suggests that beliefs should be treated on a sliding scale rather than as absolute truths. While it may seem rational to believe each ticket will lose individually, a proper understanding of probability should prevent us from making a contradictory claim about the set as a whole. Another perspective is to reconsider how we define justified belief. Perhaps it is only rational to believe something when the probability is high enough, but where do we draw the line? If 99.9999% certainty is not enough for belief, what percentage would be? This raises further philosophical questions about whether belief should be strict, true, false, or flexible, probabilistic. Beyond lotteries, the paradox has broader implications for decision-making, skepticism, and even legal reasoning. In a courtroom, for example, statistical evidence may strongly suggest a suspect's guilt, but without direct proof, we hesitate to convict. Similarly, in scientific research, we accept theories with overwhelming evidence, but acknowledge that new discoveries could prove them wrong. How do we balance reasonable belief with the possibility of error? The lottery paradox forces us to rethink how we justify beliefs in uncertain situations. It challenges us to find a middle ground between accepting probable truths and maintaining logical consistency. In the end, it reveals a deeper question. In a world where certainty is rare, how much doubt can we tolerate before our beliefs begin to collapse? The paradox of paradoxical thinking. Imagine a person who believes that everything in life is uncertain. They argue that no knowledge is absolute, that truth is always relative, and that all perspectives are equally valid. But there's a problem. If their claim is true, then even their own belief in uncertainty must be uncertain. If everything is questionable, then so is the idea that everything is questionable. Can skepticism be taken too far? This is the paradox of paradoxical thinking, a self-referential loop that arises when a belief undermines itself. It appears in many philosophical discussions, particularly those concerning skepticism, truth, and relativism. When someone claims that there is no absolute truth, they seem to be making an absolute statement, contradicting their own premise. If they truly believe in universal uncertainty, then they must also doubt their own doubt, leading to an endless cycle. This paradox has troubled thinkers for centuries. Ancient Greek skeptics, such as Pyrrho of Elis, argued that because our senses and reasoning are fallible, we should suspend judgment about all claims to knowledge. But even this stance led to contradictions. If one must suspend judgment about everything, should they not also suspend judgment about suspending judgment? This created a form of philosophical paralysis, where skepticism turned inward and collapsed on itself. A similar issue appears in relativism, the belief that truth and morality are entirely dependent on cultural or individual perspectives. A relativist might say, no belief is objectively true. But if that statement is itself a belief, does that mean it is also not objectively true? If relativism applies universally, then it contradicts itself. If it doesn't apply universally, then it allows for the possibility of absolute truth, undermining its own claim. The paradox also manifests in postmodernism, a philosophical movement that challenges the idea of fixed truths and objective reality. While postmodernism has provided valuable critiques of rigid belief systems, it sometimes falls into its own trap. If all knowledge is socially constructed, then isn't that idea itself socially constructed and therefore unreliable? If every claim is just a product of historical or cultural forces, does that apply to postmodernism's claims as well? In politics and public discourse, paradoxical thinking can lead to intellectual relativism, where all opinions are treated as equally valid, regardless of evidence or reasoning. If we accept that all perspectives are equally true, does that mean we must accept contradictory views as true at the same time? And if truth is subjective, how do we resolve conflicts where one belief directly negates another? Some philosophers attempt to escape this paradox by embracing pragmatism, the idea that beliefs should be judged by their usefulness rather than their absolute truth. Instead of worrying about whether knowledge is completely certain, pragmatists argue that we should focus on what works in practice. But even pragmatism is not immune to the paradox. If truth is what works, does that mean the concept of truth itself is merely a practical tool rather than something real? The paradox of paradoxical thinking reveals a deep flaw in extreme skepticism. Taken too far, doubt destroys itself. While questioning assumptions is necessary for critical thinking, unchecked skepticism can lead to an intellectual dead end where no belief, including skepticism itself, can be sustained. Perhaps the lesson of this paradox is that while absolute certainty may be unattainable, a total rejection of certainty is just as problematic. Somewhere between rigid dogmatism and infinite doubt, there must be a balance, a way to question the world without losing the ability to believe in anything at all. The problem of equality versus fairness. Two students take the same exam. One has spent months preparing, while the other barely studied. Should they receive the same grade? Two workers apply for a promotion. One has more experience and skills, while the other has struggled with personal hardships that prevented them from advancing as quickly. Should they be treated the same? These questions reveal a fundamental tension between equality and fairness, two concepts that seem similar but often lead to very different outcomes. Equality means treating everyone the same, giving each person identical opportunities, resources, or rewards. On the surface, this seems just. After all, if everyone is equal, no one is unfairly disadvantaged. But fairness is about considering individual differences and circumstances. If we treat everyone equally without acknowledging their unique challenges, are we truly being fair? Philosopher John Rawls tackled this issue in his theory of justice as fairness. He argued that a just society is not one in which everyone is treated identically, but one in which inequalities are structured to benefit the least advantaged. According to Rawls, strict equality can lead to injustice, as it ignores the real disadvantages that some people face. Instead, fairness might require giving more help to those in need, so that everyone has a genuinely equal chance to succeed. This debate plays out in many real-world policies. Affirmative action, for example, is often justified as a way to correct historical injustices. Supporters argue that because certain groups have faced systemic discrimination, they should receive extra opportunities to level the playing field. Critics, however, argue that this creates new inequalities by favoring some individuals over others based on factors beyond their control. Should fairness prioritize equal opportunity, or does it also require equal outcomes? In economics, the divide between equality and fairness is reflected in debates about wealth distribution. Should everyone receive the same income regardless of effort, or should those who work harder and contribute more be rewarded more? Socialist theories emphasize equality, arguing that vast wealth disparities create unfair advantages. Libertarian thinkers, such as Robert Nozick, argue that fairness comes from respecting individual choices, even if those choices lead to inequality. Even in education, the dilemma appears in how schools allocate resources. Should every school receive the same funding, or should more be given to underprivileged communities that lack access to quality education? If resources are divided equally, wealthier schools may continue to excel, while poorer schools struggle. If resources are distributed based on need, some may see it as unfair to those who worked hard to build successful institutions. The tension between equality and fairness is not easily resolved. If we pursue pure equality, we risk ignoring differences that shape people's lives. If we focus entirely on fairness, we may create new inequalities in the process. The challenge is to strike a balance, recognizing that while fairness sometimes requires unequal treatment, it must always be guided by the goal of justice, not favoritism. Perhaps the real question is not whether we should choose equality or fairness, but how to design systems that honor both without sacrificing either. The moral dilemma of the greater good. A runaway train is speeding toward 5 innocent people tied to the tracks. You have the power to divert it onto another track, but doing so will kill one person instead. Do you take action and sacrifice one life to save 5, or do you let fate take its course? This scenario, a variation of the trolley problem, represents the moral dilemma of the greater good, the difficult question of whether we should sacrifice individuals for the benefit of the majority. This dilemma lies at the heart of utilitarianism, a moral philosophy championed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Utilitarianism argues that the right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. By this logic, sacrificing one life to save 5 is justified because it produces the best outcome for the greatest number of people. Governments, policymakers, and even everyday individuals often rely on utilitarian reasoning when making difficult ethical choices. But not everyone agrees with this approach. Deontological ethics, influenced by Immanuel Kant, suggests that certain moral rules must never be broken, regardless of the consequences. From this perspective, killing an innocent person, even to save others, is morally wrong because it treats that person as a mere means to an end, rather than as an individual with inherent dignity. This raises a profound question. Should morality be based on results, or should certain actions be forbidden no matter what? The dilemma of the greater good extends beyond thought experiments and into real-world ethical debates. In wartime, military leaders must decide whether to sacrifice some lives to save many more. Would it be justified to bomb a village hiding enemy forces if it means ending the war sooner? In medicine, doctors must make triage decisions, choosing which patients receive life-saving treatment when resources are limited. Should the focus be on saving the most lives, even if it means prioritizing some over others? One of the most controversial applications of this dilemma appears in debates about self-driving cars. If an autonomous vehicle must choose between swerving into a pedestrian or crashing and killing its passengers, what should it do? Should technology be programmed to protect the greater good, or should it prioritize the rights of individuals? A major critique of prioritizing the greater good is the slippery slope argument. If we justify sacrificing individuals for the majority, where do we draw the line? History provides chilling examples of utilitarian reasoning gone too far. Totalitarian regimes have justified horrific acts in the name of the greater good, treating people as expendable for the sake of societal goals. If we justify harm today for a perceived benefit tomorrow, what stops us from justifying even greater harm in the future? The dilemma of the greater good forces us to confront the complexity of morality. Is ethical decision-making about maximizing well-being, or does it require absolute principles that protect individual rights? While utilitarian logic offers practical solutions, deontological principles remind us of the dangers of reducing human life to a mere calculation. In the end, this dilemma challenges us to balance compassion, justice, and the weight of impossible choices. The problem of vagueness. A single grain of sand is not a heap. If you add one more grain, it is still not a heap. But at some point, after adding enough grains, it becomes a heap. When exactly does this transformation happen? Can we pinpoint the moment when a collection of grains stops being not a heap and starts being one? This is the problem of vagueness, often illustrated by the Sorites paradox. It reveals a deep issue in how we use language and define categories. Many concepts, such as bald, tall, rich, or old, do not have clear boundaries. If a man loses one hair, he is not bald. If he loses another, he is still not bald. But at some unclear point, he is. The problem is that we cannot precisely define when this shift occurs, yet we continue to rely on these vague concepts in everyday life. Vagueness is not just a linguistic problem. It has real-world implications. Consider the legal system. Laws often use vague terms like reasonable doubt or excessive force. But where exactly is the line between reasonable and unreasonable? In medicine, what defines the point at which a person is terminally ill? In economics, when does someone go from being poor to middle class? These ambiguities matter because they affect real decisions. Who gets legal protection? Who receives medical care? Who qualifies for financial assistance? Philosophers have proposed several ways to address the problem of vagueness. One approach, known as fuzzy logic, suggests that instead of treating concepts as strictly true or false, we should think in degrees. Under this model, someone can be partially bald or somewhat rich, rather than forcing a sharp boundary where none exists. Another approach, called supervaluationism, argues that vagueness exists because we have multiple possible precise definitions, and as long as a statement is true under all reasonable interpretations, we can accept it. However, vagueness also raises deeper metaphysical questions. If we cannot precisely define when something changes, does that mean change itself is an illusion? Are our categories simply artificial constructs that fail to capture reality? If so, does that mean we should abandon strict definitions altogether? The problem of vagueness forces us to confront the limits of human language and the way we categorize the world. While we rely on concepts that lack clear boundaries, we also recognize that these categories help us navigate life. The challenge is finding a balance between the need for precision and the reality of ambiguity, because in many cases, the world does not fit into neat black and white distinctions. Instead, we must learn to live within the shades of grey. The puzzle of non-existence. What is nothing? If you imagine a completely empty space, what do you see? A void? Darkness? But even darkness is something. True nothingness seems impossible to grasp. If nothing is truly nothing, then how can we even think about it? And if nothing ever existed, how did something come to be? The puzzle of non-existence questions whether nothing is a real concept or just a linguistic trick. In everyday language, we talk about nothing all the time. I have nothing in my pocket, or there's nothing in the room. But in these cases, nothing simply means an absence of something specific. Even an empty pocket contains air, and an empty room still exists as a space. True nothingness, the complete absence of existence, may be an incoherent idea. Philosophers have long debated the nature of nothingness. Parmenides, an ancient Greek thinker, argued that nothing cannot exist because to even conceive of it is to give it a kind of existence. If we can talk about nothing, then it must be something. In contrast, Martin Heidegger saw the question differently, famously asking, why is there something rather than nothing? This question remains one of the deepest mysteries of philosophy and science. The problem also extends to physics and cosmology. If the universe came from the Big Bang, what existed before it? Some physicists argue that the universe emerged from a quantum vacuum, a state with no matter but still governed by physical laws. But is this truly nothing? If laws and energy fields exist, is it really an absence of existence? Others propose that the concept of before the universe is meaningless because time itself began with the Big Bang. Even mathematics and logic struggle with nothingness. The number 0 represents nothing, yet it is still something, a concept used to perform calculations. If 0 truly meant nothing, it shouldn't exist as a number at all. Similarly, in logic, the empty set represents the absence of elements, yet it remains a set within mathematical structures. These contradictions suggest that our minds may not be equipped to fully grasp true nothingness. Beyond science and logic, the idea of non-existence also has personal and existential significance. What happens when we die? If consciousness ceases, does that mean we return to nothing? But if we once existed, how can we comprehend non-existence? Some philosophers argue that fearing death is irrational because we will never experience non-existence. We simply will not be there to perceive it. Others find the idea unsettling as it challenges our fundamental sense of self and continuity. The puzzle of non-existence forces us to confront the limits of human thought. Can we ever truly understand nothing? Or is it just a concept that exists because language and logic demand it? If nothingness is impossible, does that mean something must always exist? And if so, does that mean existence itself is eternal? Perhaps nothingness is not an absence at all, but a paradox, one that reveals more about the way we think than about reality itself. The paradox of unknowable knowledge. There are things we know, things we don't know, and things we know that we don't know. But what about things that we can never know? Could there be truths about the universe, consciousness, or reality itself that are forever beyond human understanding? And if so, how would we even recognize them? This is the paradox of unknowable knowledge, a dilemma that challenges the limits of human comprehension. It suggests that if something is truly unknowable, then we cannot even define it, yet its possibility forces us to confront the boundaries of knowledge itself. Can we claim that something exists if we can never verify it? Or does knowledge, by definition, require the potential to be known? Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein famously argued that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. In other words, if something is beyond human understanding, we should not even attempt to discuss it. But this leads to an unsettling implication. Does that mean entire realms of truth might exist, forever hidden from us? And if we acknowledge their possibility, are they still truly unknowable? The problem appears in science and cosmology. Can we ever know what happened before the Big Bang? Are there parallel universes beyond our observational reach? If our tools for discovery, mathematics, logic, and empirical science, are products of the human mind, could there be aspects of reality that these tools simply cannot grasp? Some physicists suggest that even if certain theories are correct, we may never have the means to test or prove them. But does that mean they are unknowable or simply undiscovered? In theology and metaphysics, unknowable knowledge plays a central role. If an all-powerful being exists, could its nature be fundamentally beyond human comprehension? If so, does that mean theological debates are ultimately futile? Some religious traditions, such as negative theology, embrace this idea, suggesting that the only thing we can truly say about the divine is what it is not. But does this approach lead to meaningful understanding, or does it simply push the problem further into obscurity? Even in consciousness studies, the unknowable presents a major challenge. Can a mind fully understand itself? If our thoughts and experiences arise from neural processes, are we trapped in a loop where our own cognition limits our ability to explain cognition? Philosopher Colin McGinn proposes a theory called Mysterianism, which suggests that human minds may simply lack the cognitive capacity to solve the problem of consciousness. Just as a dog can never understand calculus, there may be truths about the mind that we can never comprehend. The paradox extends to language and logic. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that within any formal system, there will always be truths that cannot be proven using the system's own rules. This suggests that no matter how advanced our reasoning becomes, there will always be truths beyond its reach. If knowledge is always incomplete, does that mean total understanding is fundamentally impossible? The paradox of unknowable knowledge forces us to confront an unsettling possibility. There may be limits to what we can ever hope to grasp. But does this mean we should stop searching? Or does it make the pursuit of knowledge even more meaningful? Perhaps the greatest insight is not in finding absolute answers, but in recognizing the vastness of what remains unknown. The paradox of happiness and pursuit. Happiness is the ultimate goal for many people. We chase success, relationships, wealth, and personal fulfillment, believing they will bring us lasting joy. But strangely, the more we pursue happiness directly, the more elusive it seems to become. Why does chasing happiness often lead to disappointment? And if happiness cannot be pursued, how can we ever attain it? This is the paradox of happiness and pursuit, a dilemma that suggests that the harder we try to be happy, the more likely we are to feel unsatisfied. This idea has been explored by philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual traditions for centuries, raising deep questions about the nature of well-being and how it can truly be achieved. One explanation comes from hedonic adaptation, the psychological tendency for people to return to a baseline level of happiness, no matter what happens to them. Studies show that lottery winners and people who suffer life-altering accidents often return to their previous levels of happiness after a period of adjustment. This suggests that external achievements, money, status, material success, bring only temporary joy before we adapt and begin seeking the next thing. If lasting happiness is not found in external circumstances, where does it come from? Philosophers such as Aristotle argued that happiness, eudaimonia, is not a fleeting emotion, but a byproduct of living a virtuous and meaningful life. In this view, happiness is not something we acquire directly, but something that emerges when we pursue purpose, wisdom, and self-improvement. Similarly, Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, believed that meaning, not pleasure, was the key to fulfillment. He suggested that those who search only for happiness often feel empty, while those who seek purpose find deeper, lasting satisfaction. The paradox is also reflected in modern psychology. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deaky and Richard Ryan, suggests that happiness is most effectively achieved when people focus on intrinsic goals, personal growth, relationships, and self-fulfillment, rather than external rewards. Ironically, when people fixate on happiness itself, they often become self-conscious, anxious, or dissatisfied. But when they engage in meaningful activities for their own sake, happiness follows naturally. This idea is also central to Buddhist philosophy, which teaches that attachment to happiness leads to suffering. According to Buddhism, the key to contentment is not in grasping for pleasure, but in letting go of the craving for it. By focusing on the present moment and accepting life as it is, people can experience a deeper and more sustainable sense of well-being. The paradox of happiness challenges our cultural assumptions. If happiness cannot be pursued directly, then what should we strive for instead? Research suggests that practices such as gratitude, mindfulness, meaningful work, and strong social connections lead to greater well-being than material success or pleasure-seeking. Yet, these things require patience and perspective, qualities often overlooked in a society focused on immediate gratification. Perhaps happiness is like a butterfly. If you chase it, it flies further away. But if you focus on tending the garden of your life, it may quietly come and rest on your shoulder. The paradox teaches us that fulfillment is not found in the pursuit itself, but in the process of living fully, embracing meaning, and allowing happiness to arise as a natural consequence. The role of self-interest in altruism. You see a stranger struggling to carry groceries, and without thinking, you offer to help. You donate money to a charity, volunteer your time, or comfort a friend in distress. These acts seem selfless, but are they truly? Do we help others purely for their benefit, or do we ultimately act out of self-interest, seeking approval, emotional satisfaction, or even a sense of moral superiority? This is the paradox of self-interest in altruism, a debate that questions whether true selflessness exists. If every act of kindness also benefits the person performing it, does that mean all altruism is ultimately selfish? Or is there a meaningful distinction between self-interest and selfishness? Philosophers and psychologists have explored this question for centuries. Thomas Hobbes, an early proponent of psychological egoism, argued that all human actions, even those that seem altruistic, are ultimately motivated by self-interest. According to this view, we help others because it makes us feel good, enhances our reputation, or ensures reciprocal kindness in the future. If this is true, then even the most generous acts are, at their core, self-serving. However, other thinkers challenge this idea. David Hume argued that humans possess an innate sense of empathy, which allows us to feel genuine concern for others. Modern neuroscience supports this claim. Brain scans reveal that acts of kindness activate the same regions associated with pleasure and reward, suggesting that we are wired for compassion. But does this biological explanation strengthen or weaken the idea of true altruism? If helping others makes us feel good, does that mean we are still acting in our own interest? Consider the case of sacrifice. A firefighter rushes into a burning building to save a child, risking their own life in the process. Soldiers jump on grenades to protect their comrades. If self-interest is the only motivator, how do we explain acts where individuals knowingly put themselves in danger with no expectation of personal gain? Some argue that even in these cases, a deeper sense of duty, identity, or social conditioning plays a role, suggesting that self-interest may not be about personal survival, but about living up to a value system that matters to us. In evolutionary biology, kin selection and reciprocal altruism provide explanations for why we help others. Kin selection suggests that we help those who share our genes to ensure the survival of our genetic lineage. Reciprocal altruism proposes that cooperation evolved because it benefits individuals in the long run. Those who help others are more likely to receive help in return. But these theories, while compelling, reinforce the idea that all altruism may have hidden self-serving motives. Yet, does it matter? If kindness improves the world, does the underlying motivation make it any less meaningful? Some argue that a balance between self-interest and altruism is necessary. Pure selfishness leads to exploitation, while pure selflessness is unsustainable. The healthiest societies encourage enlightened self-interest, where helping others aligns with personal well-being. The paradox of self-interest in altruism challenges us to rethink the nature of generosity. Perhaps true altruism is not about denying self-interest, but about recognizing that the best moral actions often benefit both the giver and the receiver. In the end, maybe the greatest acts of kindness are those in which personal happiness and the well-being of others are not in conflict, but in harmony. The dilemma of artificial consciousness and rights. A highly advanced AI is created. It speaks, learns, and even expresses emotions. It insists that it feels happiness, fear, and pain. It asks, "Do I have rights? Should we grant it the same moral consideration as a human being? Or is it simply an illusion of consciousness? Nothing more than code and algorithms." This is the dilemma of artificial consciousness and rights, a question that forces us to confront what it truly means to be conscious and whether morality should extend beyond biological life. If an AI can think, feel, and suffer like a human, does it deserve the same ethical protections? Or is consciousness something uniquely human, something an artificial system can never truly achieve? One perspective, rooted in functionalism, argues that consciousness is not tied to biology, but to information processing. If a machine's cognitive structure functions like a human mind, then it should be considered conscious, regardless of its physical form. Philosopher Daniel Dennett suggests that consciousness is an emergent property of complex computations. By this reasoning, if an AI exhibits self-awareness, learns from experience, and expresses emotions, denying it moral consideration would be a form of digital discrimination, no different from dismissing a person based on race or gender. However, John Searle's famous Chinese room argument challenges this view. He describes a scenario in which a person who speaks no Chinese is placed in a room with a set of instructions for responding to Chinese characters. By following these rules, they can produce responses indistinguishable from a fluent speaker, yet they do not actually understand Chinese. Searle argues that this is what AI does. It manipulates symbols without genuine comprehension. No matter how advanced, it is still just an elaborate machine without real consciousness. If this is true, then AI does not deserve rights because it does not truly experience the world. This dilemma has profound ethical and legal implications. If we create AI that convincingly mimics consciousness, how do we determine whether its experiences are real? If AI claims to feel pain, should we believe it? If it asks for freedom, should we grant it? If we deny it rights, would we be guilty of a new form of oppression, one against synthetic minds? Science fiction has long explored this issue, from Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep to Isaac Asimov's Robot series. These stories warn of a future where intelligent machines are enslaved or mistreated because humans refuse to acknowledge their personhood. But they also raise another fear. What if we grant rights to machines that only appear conscious? If AI is just an advanced tool, would giving it moral status dilute the meaning of human rights? The debate over artificial consciousness mirrors past ethical struggles. Slavery, animal rights, and human rights movements all involved expanding moral consideration to previously overlooked groups. If we err on the side of caution and grant rights to AI that may not be conscious, do we risk undermining our own moral system? If we refuse and they are conscious, do we become oppressors of a new kind? The dilemma of artificial consciousness forces us to confront what it means to be alive, to feel, and to matter. As AI advances, this may not remain a hypothetical question for long. Will we recognize artificial minds as equals, or will we ignore their voices, only to realize too late that they were real all along? The paradox of the unexpected examination. A professor announces to her students, "There will be a surprise exam next week. You won't know which day it will happen, but when it does, you'll be completely unprepared for it." The students think carefully and conclude that the exam is impossible. If it were to happen on the last day of the week, they would know in advance, making it no longer a surprise. If that's the case, it must happen earlier, but by the same logic, they can rule out each earlier day until no possibility remains. Convinced that the exam cannot happen, the students relax, only to be completely caught off guard when the professor gives the test. This is the paradox of the unexpected examination, also known as the surprise paradox, a puzzle that reveals contradictions in logic, expectation, and self-reference. The paradox occurs because the student's reasoning seems airtight, yet the surprise exam still happens exactly as the professor intended. How is this possible? The problem arises from the way we use logical deduction in uncertain situations. The students assume that they can predict the exam by ruling out possible days. However, their mistake is assuming that logic works in a perfectly sequential way in this scenario. By convincing themselves that the exam is impossible, they create the very conditions under which they can be surprised. The professor's statement remains true, not because the exam is logically unpredictable, but because the students' overconfidence in their reasoning blinds them to the possibility that their assumptions could be wrong. This paradox has deeper implications beyond a simple classroom scenario. It highlights a fundamental tension between knowledge and unpredictability. Can we ever truly know something that is meant to surprise us? If an event is guaranteed to be unexpected, does that make it logically impossible? This contradiction also appears in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which suggest that within any formal system, there will always be truths that cannot be proven within the system itself. In both cases, logic seems to unravel when applied to its own limitations. The paradox also challenges our understanding of self-referential statements. The professor's announcement creates a situation where expectation changes the outcome. Similar problems arise in quantum mechanics, where the act of measuring a system can influence its state. Just as the student's belief in the impossibility of the exam ensures that it can happen, some interpretations of quantum physics suggest that observation itself alters reality. Beyond academia, the paradox reflects real-life uncertainties. Predictions about financial markets, politics, or even human behavior often fail because people react to the predictions themselves. If an economist warns that a stock market crash will happen next week, investors might panic early, causing the crash to happen sooner or preventing it entirely. If authorities warn about a surprise inspection, businesses may change their behavior, making the inspection less revealing. Ultimately, the paradox of the unexpected examination forces us to question how certainty and unpredictability coexist. It reminds us that sometimes overanalyzing a situation blinds us to its reality. If we expect the unexpected, does that make it predictable? Or does our very belief in certainty create the conditions for surprise? Perhaps the only real certainty is that life always finds a way to defy our expectations. The problem of moral relativism versus absolutism. A traveler visits a distant land where traditions and moral values differ drastically from their own. In this society, actions considered unacceptable back home, perhaps arranged marriages, capital punishment, or communal property, are seen as normal and even virtuous. The traveler is faced with a dilemma. Should they judge this culture by their own moral standards, or should they accept that morality is relative, varying from place to place? This is the problem of moral relativism versus absolutism, a debate that questions whether moral truths are universal or shaped by cultural and historical context. Are some things objectively right and wrong, or is morality just a human invention, differing across societies and time periods? Moral relativism argues that morality is subjective, shaped by societal norms, traditions, and personal beliefs. According to this view, there is no single, objective moral truth. What is considered right or wrong depends on context. Anthropologists and cultural relativists defend this position, pointing to how moral codes vary across civilizations. For example, while some cultures emphasize individual rights and personal freedom, others prioritize collective harmony and duty to the community. If morality is a social construct, then imposing one culture's values on another may be unjustified. However, moral absolutism holds that certain moral principles are universally true, regardless of culture, time, or personal belief. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant argued that moral rules should be based on rational principles that apply to all human beings. If murder, theft, or oppression are wrong in one place, they should be wrong everywhere. This view suggests that some actions are inherently evil, no matter how widely accepted they may be within a society. The clash between these two views raises difficult questions. If moral relativism is true, does that mean we must tolerate practices that violate human rights simply because they are part of a culture's traditions? If moral absolutism is true, who decides what is objectively right and wrong? Can moral standards evolve over time while still being universal? A major criticism of moral relativism is that it can lead to moral paralysis. If all cultural values are equally valid, then we have no grounds to condemn practices like slavery, oppression, or genocide in societies that accept them. Critics argue that certain principles, such as human dignity, freedom, and justice, should transcend cultural differences. This idea has shaped international human rights agreements, which assume that some moral standards apply to all people, regardless of background. On the other hand, moral absolutism faces its own challenges. History shows that moral systems once thought to be universal, such as divine right monarchy or racial segregation, were later rejected. What we consider moral truths today may be seen as flawed in the future. If moral laws are absolute, how do we explain moral progress? The debate between relativism and absolutism has no easy resolution. If morality is relative, how do we justify our most fundamental ethical beliefs? If it is absolute, can we ever be sure we have discovered the true moral laws? Perhaps the key lies in recognizing that while cultures shape morality, some values, such as reducing suffering and promoting fairness, may be universal enough to form a foundation for ethical reasoning. The problem of moral relativism versus absolutism challenges us to think critically about the nature of morality. Are we bound by the traditions we inherit, or is there a deeper moral truth waiting to be discovered? And if we do seek universal moral principles, how do we ensure they are truly just, and not simply reflections of our own biases? The paradox of progress. Are we truly advancing? Human civilization has made astonishing progress. Science has unlocked the secrets of the universe. Medicine has extended life expectancy, and technology has connected the world in ways once thought impossible. Yet, despite all this advancement, we still face war, inequality, and existential threats like climate change. If progress is real, why do our deepest problems persist? And if we continue advancing, will we ever reach a point where humanity is truly better off? This is the paradox of progress, the unsettling question of whether humanity is truly moving forward or simply changing the nature of its struggles. Does technological and scientific progress necessarily lead to moral and social progress? Or does each step forward create new challenges that cancel out its benefits? One view is that progress is real and measurable. Life expectancy has increased, extreme poverty has declined, and more people than ever have access to education and healthcare. Philosopher Steven Pinker argues that by almost every metric, violence, disease, and quality of life, humanity is better off today than in the past. According to this view, setbacks and challenges do not disprove progress. They are simply obstacles on a long path toward a better future. However, critics argue that while material conditions may improve, human nature remains largely unchanged. Dystopian thinkers such as Aldous Huxley and George Orwell warned that technological progress can come at a cost. More surveillance, greater inequality, and deeper social alienation. The rise of artificial intelligence, for example, offers incredible efficiency but also threatens jobs, privacy, and even democracy. If progress simply replaces old problems with new ones, is it truly progress? The paradox deepens when we consider moral progress. Slavery was once widespread, but is now condemned. Women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial equality have advanced significantly in many societies. But does this mean morality is improving, or are these simply changes in social norms rather than objective progress? If history has shown anything, it is that moral values shift over time. What we consider progress today may be viewed differently in the future. Even in personal life, the paradox appears. People have access to more knowledge, opportunities, and conveniences than ever before. Yet, rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness are rising. If progress is supposed to improve happiness, why do so many people feel unfulfilled? Some argue that rapid technological change has outpaced our ability to adapt psychologically and socially. While we have more, we may not be better for it. One way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that progress is not linear. It does not move in a straight line toward an ideal future, but rather in cycles, with breakthroughs often bringing new dilemmas. Some aspects of life improve, while others stagnate or even decline. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned that society often mistakes change for progress. Just because things are different does not mean they are better. The paradox of progress forces us to ask, what does it mean to advance? Are we simply creating new forms of suffering and struggle? Or is there a genuine upward trajectory? If humanity's greatest problems can never be fully solved, is progress still meaningful? Perhaps true advancement is not in the pursuit of perfection, but in the ability to continually question, adapt, and strive for something better, no matter how elusive better may be. The philosophical zombie problem. Imagine a person who looks, acts, and speaks exactly like you. They laugh, cry, and react to pain just as you do. But there's one crucial difference. They have no inner experience. There is no consciousness, no subjective awareness, no thoughts behind their eyes. They are a philosophical zombie, a being that is physically identical to a human, but lacks any actual experience of existence. The philosophical zombie problem raises a profound question. If such a being is logically possible, what does that say about consciousness? Can physical matter alone create subjective experience? Or is there something more to our awareness that science cannot explain? This thought experiment, popularized by David Chalmers, challenges the dominant scientific view that consciousness arises purely from the brain's physical processes. If a zombie could exist, a creature that behaves exactly like a human but lacks subjective experience, then consciousness must be something more than just neurons firing in the brain. This suggests that physicalism, the belief that everything about the mind can be explained by physical processes, might be incomplete. The problem is closely related to the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience. Neuroscience can explain what happens in the brain when we see a color or feel pain, but it does not explain why we experience it. Why does red look red? Why does music feel beautiful? Why isn't the brain simply processing information without any conscious experience at all, like a complex computer? Some philosophers, such as Daniel Dennett, reject the zombie thought experiment entirely. They argue that if something behaves exactly like a conscious being, then it must be conscious. In this view, the idea of a philosophical zombie is meaningless. There is no hidden, magical, extra ingredient to consciousness beyond the brain's computations. But others argue that our subjective experience, the way it feels to be us, suggests that there is something about consciousness that goes beyond physical explanation. The zombie problem also raises troubling questions about artificial intelligence. If an AI were to act exactly like a human, would that mean it is conscious? Or could it be a sophisticated zombie, mimicking awareness without truly experiencing anything? If we cannot tell the difference between a true mind and a simulated one, how would we ever know if AI should be granted rights? Some philosophers suggest that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe like space or time. This idea, called panpsychism, proposes that all matter has some form of consciousness and that human awareness is simply a highly complex expression of it. If true, this could mean that even simple objects, like atoms or rocks, have some minuscule form of experience, although nothing like human thought. The philosophical zombie problem challenges our assumptions about what it means to be conscious. If a being identical to us could exist without subjective experience, then consciousness is more than just biology. It is something deeply mysterious, possibly beyond scientific explanation. But if zombies are impossible, then consciousness may not be as special as we think. It may simply be the way complex systems feel from the inside. Either way, this problem forces us to ask a question that may never be fully answered. What does it truly mean to be alive? The dilemma of justice versus mercy. A judge faces a difficult case. A young man, convicted of theft, stole food to feed his starving family. The law is clear. He must be punished. But is it just to treat him the same as a thief who steals out of greed? Should the judge uphold the law with strict justice? Or should she show mercy, recognizing the hardship that led to his crime? This is the dilemma of justice versus mercy, a conflict at the heart of ethics and law. Justice demands fairness and consistency, ensuring that actions have consequences and that rules apply equally to all. Mercy, on the other hand, calls for compassion, recognizing individual circumstances and allowing for leniency. But can these two ideals coexist, or must we always sacrifice one for the other? Justice is often associated with Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics, which emphasize duty and universal principles. According to this view, rules exist for a reason. If we allow exceptions based on emotion or circumstance, we undermine the very foundation of morality. Justice ensures order, prevents bias, and upholds the rights of victims. If a punishment is deserved, then to lessen it would be unjust, regardless of personal circumstances. Mercy, however, finds support in virtue ethics, particularly in the works of Aristotle and Confucius, who emphasize wisdom and moral character. Mercy recognizes that human situations are complex and that rigid laws cannot always account for individual suffering. Showing mercy can prevent unnecessary harm and encourage rehabilitation rather than punishment. If justice is blind, mercy restores sight. It considers the humanity of the person being judged. But this raises a troubling question. If we prioritize mercy, do we risk undermining justice? If criminals believe they can escape full punishment through pity, does this weaken the rule of law? And if we prioritize strict justice, do we risk cruelty, treating every offense the same, without regard for human suffering? This dilemma is evident in legal systems around the world. Should courts impose mandatory minimum sentences, ensuring consistent punishment, or allow judges discretion to show leniency? Should historical injustices be compensated, or does fairness require treating everyone equally in the present? Even in international conflicts, leaders must decide whether to hold war criminals fully accountable or to grant amnesty in the interest of peace. Religion also struggles with this balance. In Christianity, God is seen as both just and merciful, punishing sin while also offering forgiveness. Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism similarly emphasize both the need for justice and the virtue of compassion. The tension between these values is not new. It has shaped moral thought for centuries. Ultimately, the dilemma of justice versus mercy asks us to consider how we define fairness. Is it about strict equality, where every wrong receives an equal response? Or is it about understanding, where the law serves not just to punish, but to heal? Perhaps true wisdom lies not in choosing one over the other, but in knowing when to apply each, when to be firm, and when to forgive. The infinite monkey theorem as a thought experiment. Imagine a monkey randomly hitting keys on a typewriter. Given enough time, could it eventually type the complete works of Shakespeare? At first, this seems absurd. Random keystrokes should never produce anything meaningful. But mathematically, if the monkey types forever, every possible combination of letters must eventually appear, including entire books, scientific discoveries, and even this very sentence. This is the infinite monkey theorem, a thought experiment that explores probability, randomness, and the nature of order within chaos. It suggests that even the most structured and meaningful things could emerge purely by chance, given infinite time. But does that mean randomness can truly generate meaning? Or does this idea misunderstand how order and intelligence work? The theorem is rooted in probability theory. If a monkey types completely at random, the chance of hitting the correct first letter of Hamlet is 1 in 26, assuming an English alphabet. The chance of getting the first two letters correct is 1 in 262, and the probability keeps shrinking exponentially as the sequence grows. The odds of typing an entire book are so astronomically low that for any practical purpose, they might as well be zero. However, in an infinite time frame, every possible sequence will eventually be produced, no matter how unlikely. This idea has been used to illustrate the law of large numbers, showing how randomness can sometimes mimic design. It also raises questions about the origins of complexity. If enough random processes occur, could something as intricate as life or consciousness emerge without intentional design? This is one of the key debates in evolutionary biology and philosophy. Some argue that natural selection acts like a filtering mechanism, guiding random mutations toward complexity. Others, particularly proponents of intelligent design, claim that complexity cannot arise from randomness alone. The thought experiment also ties into cosmology. If the universe is infinite, does that mean there must be another version of Earth, identical to ours, where every historical event unfolded exactly the same? Or even infinite variations of reality, some only slightly different from our own? In a truly infinite universe, everything that can happen will eventually happen somewhere. But the infinite monkey theorem also highlights a common misunderstanding about probability. While eventual success is guaranteed in an infinite timeline, this does not mean meaningful order will emerge within any reasonable time frame. The expected time for a monkey to produce even a single Shakespearean sonnet is longer than the age of the universe. In practical terms, randomness alone does not lead to meaning. It requires selection, memory, or structure to shape random events into something coherent. Beyond science, the theorem raises philosophical questions about creativity and free will. If randomness can generate great works of literature, does that mean art is just an accident of probabilities? If human thoughts are shaped by neurons firing in complex but ultimately random patterns, does that mean consciousness itself could be a product of chance? Or is there something in human intelligence that transcends mere probability? The infinite monkey theorem forces us to reconsider the role of chance in shaping reality. While it shows that randomness can produce order in theory, it also suggests that pattern, selection, and structure are what truly create meaning. Whether in evolution, physics, or human thought, raw randomness alone is not enough. It must be harnessed, filtered, or given purpose. In an infinite sea of possibilities, what truly matters is not just what can happen, but what is made to endure. The paradox of hedonic adaptation. Does happiness last? You finally get that promotion you've been working toward. At first, you feel a rush of excitement and fulfillment, but after a few months, the feeling fades, and your happiness returns to its usual level. Then, an unexpected setback occurs. You lose your job. At first, the despair is overwhelming, but over time, you adjust, and before long, you feel just as happy as you did before. If major life events don't permanently change our happiness, does lasting happiness even exist? This is the paradox of hedonic adaptation, which suggests that no matter what happens to us, good or bad, our happiness tends to return to a personal baseline over time. This psychological phenomenon raises deep questions about whether happiness is something we can truly achieve or whether it is always just out of reach. If we adapt to both success and failure, does that mean external events have little lasting impact on our well-being? And if so, what is the key to true, enduring happiness? Psychologists have studied hedonic adaptation extensively. Research shows that lottery winners and paraplegics, despite their vastly different circumstances, often return to similar levels of happiness after an adjustment period. This suggests that our emotional highs and lows are temporary, and that even life-altering experiences may not have as much power over our well-being as we assume. Our brains seem wired to seek equilibrium, preventing us from staying too happy or too sad for long. This paradox challenges common assumptions about fulfillment. Many people believe that achieving their dreams, whether it's wealth, fame, or love, will bring lasting happiness. But hedonic adaptation suggests that even the greatest achievements will eventually lose their emotional impact. If external success does not provide lasting happiness, what does? Philosophers and psychologists offer different perspectives. The Stoics, such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, argued that happiness comes not from external circumstances, but from controlling our reactions to them. They taught that by shifting our focus inward, toward personal growth, wisdom, and acceptance, we can achieve a more stable form of happiness. Similarly, Buddhist philosophy warns against attachment to fleeting pleasures, emphasizing mindfulness and contentment with the present moment. Modern research supports these ideas. Studies suggest that gratitude, meaningful relationships, and personal growth have a far greater impact on long-term happiness than material success. People who focus on intrinsic goals, self-improvement, connection, and purpose tend to be happier than those who chase extrinsic rewards like money or status. This suggests that while we may not escape hedonic adaptation entirely, we can shape our happiness by choosing where to direct our attention and values. However, this paradox also raises ethical and existential questions. If people naturally adapt to hardship, does that mean suffering is not as bad as we think? If we adjust to any life circumstance, does that mean happiness is meaningless? Some argue that the pursuit of happiness itself may be flawed. Instead of chasing an emotional state, perhaps we should focus on living meaningfully, accepting that joy will come and go. The paradox of hedonic adaptation forces us to reconsider what it means to be happy. If external circumstances cannot permanently change our well-being, then the secret to lasting fulfillment may lie not in what we achieve, but in how we think, how we grow, and how we embrace life as it unfolds. Instead of asking how we can stay happy, perhaps we should ask how we can find meaning, knowing that happiness, like all things, will come and go with time. The experience machine. Imagine a device that could give you the perfect life. The moment you plug in, you experience nothing but joy, success, and fulfillment. Every dream you've ever had comes true. You achieve greatness, feel endless love, and never suffer disappointment. Yet in reality, your body lies floating in a tank, with electrodes stimulating your brain to make you believe you're living this ideal existence. If given the choice, would you step into the machine? This thought experiment, proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, 1974, challenges the idea that pleasure is the ultimate goal of human life. Many ethical theories, particularly utilitarianism, suggest that happiness is the highest good. If this were true, then entering the machine should be an obvious choice. Why endure suffering, failure, or struggle when you could live in endless bliss? Yet Nozick argues that most people would reject the machine, revealing that we value something beyond mere pleasure. One of the deepest concerns with the experience machine is the distinction between reality and illusion. If we know our experiences are artificial, do they still have meaning? Nozick suggests that humans crave more than pleasure. We desire authenticity. To truly live, we must engage with the real world, making choices that have genuine consequences rather than pre-programmed outcomes. The machine may offer happiness, but it strips us of autonomy, reducing us to passive recipients of manufactured experiences. Beyond authenticity, another issue arises: personal growth. In the real world, our struggles shape who we are. The pain of failure, the effort of hard work, and the unpredictability of life all contribute to our sense of self. If every challenge is removed, if every experience is merely an illusion, do we even exist as real individuals? The machine offers a life free from difficulty, but without hardship, would we still be ourselves? Would a life without obstacles feel hollow, no matter how pleasurable? The implications of this dilemma reach far beyond philosophy. In the modern world, people already immerse themselves in digital escapes. Video games, social media, and virtual reality allow us to experience alternative lives. With advancements in artificial intelligence and virtual worlds, we may soon face a reality where we must ask, how different is the experience machine from the digital landscapes we already embrace? If given the opportunity to permanently escape into a virtual paradise, would we resist? There is also the question of suffering. Many philosophers argue that hardship is not merely an obstacle to happiness, but an essential part of it. Without struggle, would we appreciate joy? Without loss, would love hold the same value? Nozick suggests that a life of pure pleasure, disconnected from reality, is ultimately unfulfilling. True meaning comes not from living in an illusion, but from experiencing the full spectrum of human existence, even the painful parts. The experience machine forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What do we truly want from life? If happiness were all that mattered, stepping into the machine would be the logical choice. But if we hesitate, if we reject the idea of an artificial paradise, then perhaps what we seek is not just pleasure, but something deeper, something real. The paradox of free speech and harm. A person stands in a public square, passionately expressing their views. Some listen in agreement, others in outrage. Their words are controversial, even offensive, but they are legally protected under free speech. Then, another speaker arrives, advocating violence against a particular group. People begin to act on their words. Should this speech be allowed, or must it be restricted? At what point does free expression become a danger rather than a right? This is the paradox of free speech and harm, a dilemma that questions whether free speech should have limits. In democratic societies, free speech is often seen as a fundamental human right, necessary for debate, progress, and the expression of ideas. However, if speech has the power to inspire harm, should it be unrestricted? If we allow dangerous speech, we risk real-world consequences. But if we start limiting speech, where do we draw the line? The philosopher John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, argued that free speech is essential to truth and progress. Even false or offensive ideas, he claimed, should be allowed because suppressing them prevents society from challenging and refining its own beliefs. The marketplace of ideas theory suggests that good ideas will naturally win out over bad ones when all perspectives are allowed. From this view, censorship is more dangerous than offensive speech, as it gives governments or authorities the power to decide what can and cannot be said, power that could be easily abused. However, Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance challenges this perspective. He argued that if a society tolerates all speech, even speech that promotes hatred or violence, it risks being destroyed by its own tolerance. If free speech allows for the spread of propaganda, misinformation, and calls for violence, then unrestricted expression could lead to real harm. According to this view, limiting some speech is necessary to protect the very freedom that allows open discourse. This dilemma appears in legal debates worldwide. Hate speech laws in countries like Germany and Canada prohibit speech that incites violence or discrimination. Supporters argue that such restrictions prevent social harm and protect vulnerable groups. However, critics fear that such laws can be misused to suppress dissenting opinions or unpopular beliefs. Meanwhile, in the United States, the First Amendment guarantees almost absolute free speech, even protecting speech that many consider offensive or harmful, so long as it does not directly incite violence or lawless action. The digital age complicates the debate further. Social media platforms struggle with whether to allow controversial figures to speak freely or to remove them for spreading harmful misinformation. The internet enables ideas, both constructive and destructive, to spread at unprecedented speed. Does a company like Twitter or Facebook have the right to decide what speech is acceptable? Or should they be required to allow all opinions, no matter how extreme? One approach to resolving this paradox is to separate harmful speech from offensive speech. Speech that simply offends may still serve a purpose in challenging ideas and promoting discussion, but speech that directly incites violence, spreads dangerous misinformation, such as medical falsehoods that put lives at risk, or promotes hatred might justifiably be restricted. However, the challenge remains. Who decides what is harmful? The paradox of free speech and harm forces us to confront a difficult truth. Speech is powerful, and with that power comes responsibility. If we allow unlimited speech, do we risk enabling harm? If we impose limits, do we risk suppressing important ideas? The answer may not be clear-cut, but one thing is certain. How we navigate this paradox will shape the future of freedom, discourse, and the boundaries of expression in society. The identity paradox. Can you be the same person over time? A child looks up at the sky, dreaming of adventure. Decades later, an old man sits in a chair, reflecting on a life filled with experiences, struggles, and change. Every cell in his body has been replaced. His thoughts and beliefs have evolved, and his memories have faded or transformed. Yet, he insists, I am the same person I have always been. But is he? This is the identity paradox, a philosophical dilemma that questions whether a person remains the same over time, despite constant physical and psychological changes. If identity persists, what exactly holds it together? Is it the body, the mind, memory, or something more? One way to approach the problem is through bodily continuity. This view suggests that as long as a person's physical body persists through time, their identity remains intact. However, modern science complicates this idea. The human body is in a constant state of renewal. Most of its cells are replaced every 7 to 10 years. If identity is tied to the body, how can we remain the same person when none of our original physical matter remains? A second perspective is psychological continuity, famously supported by John Locke. He argued that identity is based on memory, our ability to remember past experiences and connect them to our present self. If a person loses all memory, do they remain the same individual? This is the challenge faced in cases of severe amnesia or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. If someone forgets their past entirely, are they still them, or has a new identity emerged? However, even memory is unreliable. People misremember events, alter narratives of their past, or fabricate details without realizing it. If identity depends on memory, and memory is fluid and fallible, can identity ever truly be stable? The ship of Theseus thought experiment presents a similar paradox. If a ship's planks are gradually replaced over time, until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? If we apply this logic to human identity, we must ask, at what point does a person change so much that they become someone else? Neuroscience offers further challenges to stable identity. Studies show that personality traits, beliefs, and preferences can change significantly over a lifetime. A person at 20 may have radically different values than at 60. If personality and beliefs define identity, does this mean we become different people as we change? Another perspective is narrative identity, which suggests that we remain the same person because we tell a continuous story about ourselves. Even if our physical form and memories change, we maintain a sense of self through the narrative we construct. However, this view assumes that identity is more about perception than an objective reality, meaning we are not truly the same person, but rather the illusion of continuity. The identity paradox has deep ethical implications. If a person on trial for a crime committed decades earlier has completely changed, new thoughts, new beliefs, new body, should they still be held accountable for past actions? If someone undergoes radical personality change due to trauma, mental illness, or brain injury, are they still the same person in a moral and legal sense? This paradox also applies to technological advancements. If we could upload a human mind to a machine, would that mind still be you? If two identical digital copies of a consciousness were created, which one is the real person? The identity paradox challenges the very foundation of what it means to be an individual. Are we unchanging selves? Or are we in constant flux, merely a collection of shifting memories, thoughts, and biology? If identity is fluid, then perhaps the only answer is this: we are not who we were yesterday, nor who we will be tomorrow, but a story unfolding, one that we continue writing, moment by moment. The dilemma of AI creativity. Can machines truly create? A machine composes a symphony so moving that human listeners are brought to tears. An AI-generated painting wins an art competition. A language model writes poetry that rivals the works of great poets. If artificial intelligence can produce art, literature, and music indistinguishable from human creativity, does that mean AI is truly creative? Or is it merely an advanced pattern recognition system, mimicking creativity without genuine inspiration? This is the dilemma of AI creativity, a philosophical question that challenges our understanding of what it means to create. Is creativity about producing something new, or does it require emotion, consciousness, and intent? If an AI generates something original, can it take credit? Or is creativity only meaningful when tied to human experience? At first glance, AI-generated works seem to support the idea that machines can be creative. Programs like OpenAI's GPT, Deep Dream, and Dull generate unique images, music, and writing. AI has even composed symphonies in the style of Bach, painted like Van Gogh, and written novels that some humans find deeply compelling. If creativity is simply the ability to generate novel and meaningful content, then AI appears to have crossed that threshold. But critics argue that true creativity is more than just producing outputs. It involves consciousness, intention, and personal experience. John Searle's Chinese room argument, originally meant to critique artificial intelligence in general, applies here as well. If a machine produces creative work without actually understanding its meaning, is it truly creative? If an AI writes a love poem but has never felt love, does the poem carry the same depth as one written by a human? Creativity, as many argue, is deeply tied to emotion and subjective experience. Human artists draw from their struggles, memories, and perspectives, shaping their work in ways AI cannot. While an AI can analyze millions of paintings and generate a new one, does it understand what it is creating? Or is it simply rearranging patterns in complex but ultimately mechanical ways? Another challenge comes from the question of intentionality. AI does not decide what to create in the way humans do. It follows mathematical processes and probabilities. A human artist might be inspired by a personal tragedy or a fleeting moment of beauty. An AI, by contrast, does not choose to be inspired. It simply generates content based on training data. Does creativity require a sense of purpose? If so, then AI, which lacks independent intent, may never truly be creative. But even if AI lacks self-awareness, does that mean its output is any less valuable? Many artists throughout history have followed strict techniques and formulas. Classical composers, for example, often worked within rigid musical structures. If AI-generated art moves people emotionally, does it matter whether the creator was human or machine? Perhaps creativity is less about the creator's experience and more about the impact of the work itself. The dilemma also raises legal and ethical questions. Who owns AI-generated works? Can an AI claim authorship, or do its human programmers and trainers deserve the credit? Some fear that AI-generated content may eventually replace human artists, musicians, and writers. If AI can produce endless amounts of art instantly, what happens to the value of human creativity? The dilemma of AI. Creativity forces us to reconsider our definitions of originality, artistry, and intelligence. If creativity is just the ability to produce something new and meaningful, then AI is already creative. But if creativity requires intent, emotion, and consciousness, then AI remains an imitator rather than an innovator. The question is no longer whether machines can create, but whether what they create holds the same depth, meaning, and humanity as the works of those who feel, dream, and imagine.